Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. The contract was clean, almost surgically so, which should have been my first warning. The retainer alone was enough to make any professional paranormal investigator set aside their better judgment. But then again, a place like Blackwood Manor didn't come cheap, even as a client-side tragedy. Its reputation preceded it like a physical manifestation of cold air and pervasive dread, a reputation I'd spent 15 years documenting, dissecting, and often debunking. My name is Marcus Vance, and I deal in evidence. I am a pragmatic anchor in a sea of emotional turbulence, a scientific observer in the theater of the inexplicable. Blackwood Manor, however, felt less like a theater and more like a mausoleum still actively occupied by its tenants. The drive up was a study in New England desolation. October had stripped the trees bare, leaving the landscape a palette of granite gray and sodden brown. The manor sat atop a low, rocky hill, visible only after a winding, mile-long private road, hemmed in by ancient, skeletal oaks. It was enormous, a 3-story Victorian monstrosity of dark stone and peeling black trim, a testament to 19th century excess and Gothic gloom. It didn't look haunted, it looked infected. My client, a trust fund heir named Elias Thorne who preferred to communicate through his legal counsel, was only interested in one thing: documentation. He wanted the raw footage, the unedited audio, the hard data. He wanted proof for the courts, proof for the insurance company, and perhaps most importantly, proof for himself that the property was legally uninhabitable due to malicious spiritual interference. He offered me a 2-week term, access to the entire property, and absolute isolation. I took the keys, a single, heavy brass ring, and signed the non-disclosure agreement with a pen that felt colder than the air. My gear was everything. I wasn't some cable TV personality with infrared goggles and a theatrical jump scare budget. I utilized a methodical, layered approach. I spent the first 4 hours of my residency, what I termed Day 1, Hour 0, just mapping and deploying. I set up 5 static, high-resolution cameras in the main areas: the grand, dust-sheeted ballroom, the decaying library with its overturned shelves, the main staircase, the master suite on the 2nd floor, and the notorious basement, rumored to house the worst of the Blackwood patriarch's hidden horrors. Each camera ran to a central DVR in the makeshift command center I established in the ground floor drawing room, a spot I chose for its proximity to an exterior escape route and a working electrical outlet. I deployed multiple ambient temperature sensors, calibrated to detect fluctuations of less than 1 degree Fahrenheit, placed next to my electromagnetic field, EMF, detectors. Audio recorders, highly sensitive, were scattered throughout, constantly logging the pervasive silence. Everything was logged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. I walked through the house, detailing the pervasive smell of dust, mildew, and something acrid, almost metallic. I noted the absence of wildlife, the unnerving stillness of the air, the way sound seemed to die the moment it left my mouth. Day 1. 23:15. Initial baseline established. I dictated into my handheld recorder, my voice a dull, professional monotone meant to counter the rising tension I refused to acknowledge. Ambient temp stable at 54 degrees across all major zones. EMF readings nominal. No immediate evidence of intelligent activity. The house is quiet. Unnaturally so. That night, I tried to sleep on a military-grade cot in the drawing room, armed with nothing but my training and a heavy-duty flashlight. The silence was the first assault. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of absolute acoustic void, an almost painful pressure on the eardrums. Every creak of the ancient timbers, and there were many, each one sounding like a floorboard snapping in the distance, was amplified into a gunshot. I logged 2 distinct events before 3 o'clock. Event 1 hour 1 minute and 42 seconds. A sudden, sharp spike in EMF near the library door. It lasted exactly 4.7 seconds, reaching 6.2 mg, then vanished. When I checked the raw audio, there was only the faintest distortion, a sound like crinkling cellophane, swallowed by the silence. No corresponding temperature drop. Event 2 hours 2 minutes and 51 seconds. A rapid, localized 2-degree drop in the master suite, instantly recovering. The camera feed showed nothing but the dust sheets draped over the furniture, looking like hunched white figures in the infrared light. I didn't panic. I didn't even get up. This was standard stuff. Residual energy. Possibly a cold pocket, maybe a faulty wire or a trick of the old house settling. I logged the data, closed my eyes, and waited for the dawn. The professional protocol was holding. Marcus Vance was still in control. Day 2 began with a systematic review of the overnight data. Nothing compelling. Thorne's lawyers had painted Blackwood as the epicenter of spiritual chaos, yet I had a few blips and a lot of dead air. I moved to Phase 2, the provocation. I set up motion-activated lasers across doorways and stairwells. I introduced an environmental trigger, a single, untouched marble resting on the highest step of the main staircase, perfectly balanced. This was my test for mechanical movement. I also began my audio playback experiment. The manor's former resident, a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, was rumored to have committed suicide in the house after the disappearance of her husband. I played a loop of soft, anodyne classical music, hoping to either calm the alleged entity or trigger a reaction. The reaction came, but it was subtle, almost an insult. Around 1700 hours, while I was detailing the architecture of the dining room's ornate fireplace, I walked back toward the drawing room and noticed the marble. It was gone. I checked the camera feed. 16 hours 58 minutes and 34 seconds. The marble was resting peacefully on the wooden step. 16 hours 58 minutes and 36 seconds. It was gone. The transition was instantaneous. Not a roll, not a drop, but a simple absence. No sound was recorded, and the laser grid was not broken. The space between the step and the marble had simply ceased to exist for a split second, and gravity had done the rest. I found it later, nestled neatly against the baseboard, 5 steps down. I dictated my findings. Day 2, 1705. Object displacement observed. Nature of displacement does not align with gravity or typical mechanical failure. Suggests localized, non-mechanical force or intelligent interaction. Initial resistance is noted. The psychological shift was the most dangerous aspect of a long-term vigil like this. My brain, starved of normal stimuli and bombarded by silence, began to invent things. I started seeing movement in the corners of my eyes, the dust sheets shifting, the shadow of a hanging fixture stretching too long. The cinematic quality was starting, not on my cameras, but in my head. I had to fight the urge to spin around every time the air pressure changed. That night, the activity became more localized, zeroing in on the command center. I was sitting at my monitor, watching the 8 screens, when the lights flickered. Not the house lights. I was running off a portable generator for maximum consistency, but the fluorescent bulb hanging directly over my head. I checked the wiring. No issue. I checked the surge protector. Nominal. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was chilling in its unnatural context. A faint, repetitive scratching sound, coming from the walls directly behind the cot. I muted my input mic and focused the room's high-gain audio. Scratch. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and entirely non-human. Like something trapped behind the plaster, digging out with a sharp claw. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and tapped the wall. The scratching stopped immediately. Silence returned, heavier than before. I waited 3 minutes. Nothing. As soon as I took a step away, it resumed, only this time, it was slightly lower on the wall, as if descending. I knew the difference between rodents and resonance. This was intentional. This was the inhabitant acknowledging my presence, perhaps even mocking my professionalism. I turned the camera in the drawing room directly on the wall. I dictated my feelings, which was a breach of my own professional rules, but a necessity for documentation. Day 2 for 12. I am experiencing a calculated acoustic pressure event. The entity is utilizing the acoustics of the house to induce paranoia. It is a psychological assault, highly effective. I log a feeling of deep, profound anxiety, disproportionate to the actual stimulus. Day 3 broke cold and gray. The scratching had stopped eventually, replaced by a lingering, almost sweet floral scent in the drawing room, a scent that had no business being in a century of dust. The master suite camera now showed one of the dust sheets slightly pulled back from the armchair it covered, revealing a patch of faded velvet. It was a minor detail, but deliberate. The entity was moving things just enough to break the visual symmetry, demanding attention. I decided to go down to the basement, the area I had avoided out of a strange sense of deference. The Blackwood Patriarch, according to local legend, had used the space for things that were best left unsaid, culminating in his own brutal death there. The stairs were rotting, the air thick with damp earth and decay. I brought all my gear: IR camera, audio recorder, EMF meter, and a portable flow thermal scanner. The basement was a warren of stone and dirt, divided by crumbling brick partitions. My EMF meter immediately began to jump erratically, hitting peaks of 12 to 15 mg, high enough to be concerning, but it was also a massive junction point for the house's electrical system, so I kept my skepticism. I began filming the walls with the FLIR, looking for anomalous heat or cold signatures. Then I saw it. On the dirt floor of a small, windowless subcellar, the FLIR screen registered a distinct, perfectly formed human handprint in a vivid, freezing blue. It was a clear, 5-fingered signature of extreme cold, imprinted in the earth. It was physically impossible for a heat signature of that nature to exist without an external source, and yet there it was, radiating a thermal deficit. I immediately knelt, setting the audio recorder right next to the print. As I watched through the camera, the blue began to rapidly shrink, fading back into the ambient brown of the floor. But the audio captured something else. A faint, low groan, like the sound of wet leather stretching, right where the handprint was dissolving. It was too deep, too resonant to be from the building. It felt like the sound of grief or exertion. I got out fast, my heart pounding a rhythm that drowned out the camera's internal fan. The psychological barrier had been breached. This wasn't residual. This was intelligent, focused, and physically manifest. A handprint in the dirt, visible only in the thermal spectrum, was a direct and undeniable breach of the physical laws I trusted. I reviewed the footage upstairs for hours, running through every possibility. The EMF meters downstairs were still fluctuating wildly, but I ignored them. The handprint was the message. That night, day 3, the attacks began in earnest. I was asleep for maybe an hour when the floorboards in the hall outside the drawing room began to hammer. Not creaking, not settling, but a heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that sounded exactly like someone dragging a massive piece of furniture across the planks, stopping directly in front of the door. I threw off the blanket, adrenaline surging. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't open the door. I checked the camera feed. The camera focused on the main staircase hallway. The floor was empty. The sound, however, was deafeningly clear on the audio channel. "It's right outside the door," I whispered into my recorder, trying to keep my voice steady. "The camera shows no visual source. The sound is localized, powerful. I estimate the force required to create that resonance at over 50 pounds of downward pressure." The thumping stopped. The heavy, brass door handle of the drawing room began to rattle. Slowly at first, a metallic vibration, then a violent, frantic shaking, as if someone outside was trying to force their way in. The entire house seemed to hum with the effort. I felt the urge to scream, to grab the shotgun I hadn't brought, to do anything but remain still. I forced myself to watch the camera feed. The lens was facing the door, which was locked from the inside. In the cold, dusty air, a faint, wispy shape, almost like steam, began to coalesce at the bottom of the door. It wasn't visible in the IR, but the cold spots registered an immediate, rapid 20-degree drop. The shape solidified into a dark shadow, perfectly outlined as a standing human figure, pressing against the bottom of the door. The rattling ceased, replaced by a low, guttural hiss right on the other side of the wood. The air in the room, previously cool, now felt arctic, pulling the heat directly from my skin. This was not a ghost. This was an entity of pure malicious intent. It was trying to break the barrier between its world and mine. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching the darkness recede. The physical drain was immense. My professional resolve was dissolving into primal fear. Day 4. I started the day with a frantic check of my exit strategy. The front door was triple locked, but the ground floor window was theoretically accessible. My cell phone had gone from 2 bars of intermittent service to absolute zero. My attempts to reach Thorne's lawyers went to an automated message. I was sealed in. The entity's new strategy was disorientation. I walked up the grand staircase to retrieve an audio recorder and found the second floor completely transformed. Not physically, the walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but the entire atmosphere was distorted. The air felt like a viscous, heavy liquid. Every sound I made echoed unnaturally, lasting 3 times longer than it should have. I passed the infamous children's nursery, which was supposed to be completely sealed. The door was slightly ajar. I knew I hadn't touched it. The entity wanted me in there. I decided not to give it the satisfaction. I retrieved the recorder, which had logged hours of nothing but silence, and returned to the stairs. But the layout felt wrong. I was sure the stairs descended to the right of the drawing room. Now, they seemed to lead toward the back of the house. I checked my map. The stairs were where they should be, but my perception was warped. The house was folding in on itself, mentally isolating me. Day 4, 11:30. Experiencing severe sensory disorientation. I logged, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. The manner's spatial coherence appears to be subject to psychological manipulation. I am advised to trust the evidence, not the senses. The events escalated quickly. The cameras began to fail, not power loss, but deliberate corruption of the digital signal. Static, corrupted frames, streaks of white noise that would cover minutes of crucial footage, especially around the master suite and the library. In the library, where the shelves had been overturned, I found a book. Not a discarded book, but one placed deliberately on the reading table. It was a King James Bible, dated 1888. When I opened it, the pages were stuck together with a damp, black residue. On the blank frontispiece, written in shaky script, was a single, repeated word, "Get out." The script was old, but the residue was wet. I photographed it, bagged the book, and felt a cold fury mixed with terror. This wasn't folklore, this was a war for territory. Day 5 was a total siege. I hadn't slept in over 40 hours. My gear was failing systematically, battery life dropping from 8 hours to 20 minutes in the space of a single charge cycle, cables inexplicably frayed, and my generator sputtering erratically despite a full tank. I was trapped in the drawing room, the last stronghold. The house was no longer subtle. Around 1500 hours, the sounds began again, only this time, they were everywhere. Doors were slamming upstairs, not one, but 3 or 4 at once, a relentless, asynchronous BM. The library's heavy oak doors, which I had secured with a rope and a chair, began to visibly flex inward, the wood groaning under an unseen force. Then, the screaming. It came from the 3rd floor, high-pitched, agonizing, and distinctly female. It wasn't the sound of an echo. It was the sound of a woman being actively tortured, a sound filled with pure, unadulterated terror. I ran out of the drawing room. My professional training completely overridden by the need to stop the noise. I raced up the main staircase, flashlight beams sweeping across the landing. The screaming was overwhelming, physically painful. It seemed to come from the hallway leading to the servants' quarters. I got to the corner and stopped dead. The screaming vanished instantly. Instead, standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the beam of my flashlight, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like a tattered, old-fashioned suit. Its back was to me. It wasn't opaque. It was a shimmering, heat-hazed distortion of the air, yet it was undeniably there. "Show me your face," I rasped, my throat dry. The figure didn't move. But its right hand, long and skeletal, slowly lifted and pointed down the hall, toward the master suite. I didn't need to check the cameras to know what it was. This was the inhabitant, the malevolent anchor of Blackwood Manor. I took a shaky breath, turned, and ran back down the stairs. The objective was no longer documentation, it was survival. I locked myself back in the drawing room, stacking the furniture against the door, a futile gesture that still felt necessary. I watched the clock tick toward the night. The final confrontation came just after midnight, day 5. The entity was done with subtle warnings. The heavy, antique sideboard near the fireplace, which must have weighed 300 pounds, began to slide across the floor, scraping loudly against the ancient wood. I watched in paralyzed horror as the massive piece of furniture was pushed diagonally toward the center of the room, as easily as if it were cardboard. I shouted a raw, animalistic cry of panic. I grabbed my camera, still recording, and aimed it at the sideboard. The wood groaned, and then, slowly, a single, deep gouge, a scar of incredible force, appeared on the surface of the wood, 3 feet above the floor. A scratch mark, as if something with immense power had raked its claw across the finish. Then, the ceiling above me began to flex. The old plaster cracked, tiny fragments showering down onto my equipment. The sound was like a giant hand slowly closing on the room. The entity was applying pressure, trying to crush me. The last working audio recorder, placed near my head, picked up a final, clear sound, no distortion, no white noise. It was a laugh. A deep, dry, choking sound of pure amusement, immediately followed by the sound of glass shattering violently from the second floor. I knew I was finished. My professionalism had left me. I was just a man, terrified and alone, trapped in a house that was actively trying to kill me. The cinematic vibe was gone, replaced by a visceral, bone-deep fear. I grabbed the heavy brass keyring and the hard drive containing the only surviving footage, then lunged for the window, smashing the old glass with my elbow. I scrambled out into the cold New England night, running blindly through the barren, skeletal landscape of the manor grounds. I never looked back. I ran until the lights of the town were visible, until the first hint of morning was breaking over the eastern hills. Later, I sent the footage to Thorne's legal team with a single note. "The property is actively and intelligently hostile. Evacuation is advised. I am unable to continue the documentation." I never returned to Blackwood Manor. I retired from the profession entirely. But sometimes, when I am alone in the quiet of my new apartment, I hear it, a faint, dry, choking sound in the deep silence, like a laugh that is meant only for me. I know the inhabitant of Blackwood Manor is still there, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, they are still scratching. Story 2. You spend enough time driving a Class 8 down the long stretches of the American interior, and the world starts to shrink. It becomes a narrow cone of asphalt defined by your high beams, the stale air of the cab, and the endless rumble of the engine under your seat. Everything outside that cone turns into a blurry, interchangeable background. I'm a long-haul trucker, name's Jedediah, but everyone just calls me Jed. I specialized in the runs nobody else wanted, the dry freight routes through the forgotten corridors of the Southwest, the ones that crisscross eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, where the land is mostly scrub, rock, and history that died a long time ago. This story, the one that still has me popping Zoloft and checking my rearview mirror in the middle of a crowded diner parking lot, started on Route 666, what they've tried to rename 491, but every old-timer knows better. It was a standard haul, industrial components headed to a facility near Gallup. I'd done the run dozens of times, always in the dead of night to avoid the heat and the traffic that didn't exist anyway. The road is a black ribbon stretched over the high desert, lonely as hell. with maybe one gas station every 60 miles. The first time I saw it, I dismissed it. It was around 3 o'clock, deep into the blackest part of the night, 3 hours into my shift after a quick, stale cup of coffee. I was halfway between a town called Lupton and something even smaller. The landscape was flat, broken only by the occasional mesa in the distance. I glanced into the passenger side mirror, just a habit, checking my trailer, and that's when I saw the movement. It was on the shoulder. Just a dark shape, moving parallel to my truck maybe 50 feet back. It was too far from any town to be a regular hitchhiker, too late to be someone taking an evening walk. It was long, thin, and walking with a weird, shuffling gait. I assumed it was a deer, maybe a coyote, or some piece of blowing tumbleweed playing tricks on my tired eyes. The desert is full of optical illusions, especially when you're running on 3 hours of sleep and caffeine fumes. I blinked hard, refocused, and by the time my vision cleared, it was gone. Just an empty, dusty shoulder under the faint moonlight. I shrugged it off. Fatigue does things to your perception. I cranked the radio, trying to find a signal, anything but static, to keep my brain engaged. The second time, 3 nights later, on the return trip, I couldn't dismiss it. I was on the same stretch of highway, heading east this time, and the feeling hit me first. That cold, prickling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, even when your rational mind is screaming that you're alone in a 6-ton machine at 80 miles an hour. I checked the mirrors obsessively for 5 minutes, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Then there it was. Passenger side mirror, perfectly framed. It was walking on the dirt and gravel shoulder, maybe 40 feet behind the end of my trailer. It wasn't an animal. It was clearly bipedal, standing upright, but it was wrong. It was tall, taller than any man, and covered in something dark, maybe a heavy coat, or just shadow. Its proportions were all skewed, the limbs too long, the head perhaps too small, or maybe it was wearing something that obscured its face. What froze my blood was the way it was moving. It wasn't running. It was walking slowly, deliberately, but somehow keeping pace with my semi that was cruising at a steady 75 miles per hour. It moved with a kind of effortless glide, a smooth, impossible motion that defied the physics of a human walking. I slammed on the brakes, the ABS biting hard, the massive truck shuddering violently as I brought it down to 30. I was halfway ready to stop, get out, and confront whatever dehydrated psycho was out there. But as I slowed, it slowed. It maintained the same, impossible distance from my trailer, about 40 feet. As I decelerated, I saw its head lift slightly in the mirror, as if it was observing my reaction. When I hit the gas again, bringing the speed back up, it effortlessly matched me, its strange, long legs swallowing the distance without any visible change in effort. I floored it. I pushed the rig up to 85, faster than I should have, listening to the engine roar its complaint. I looked back. Still there. 40 feet. Walking. A cold, sick dread settled in my stomach. This wasn't a hitchhiker. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was chasing me, or rather, accompanying me, and it was playing a game. I kept the pedal down for another 10 minutes, adrenaline burning off my fatigue, until I saw the distant, faint lights of the next town. Only then, as the road began to curve and the few, scattered sodium lights from the highway off-ramp washed the shoulder, did it disappear. It didn't run off, it just seemed to unravel into the deep shadows and the dust. I pulled into the truck stop, hard hammering against my ribs, and didn't leave the cab for an hour. I checked my logbook. It was 4:30. I ran through the footage from my dash cam, hoping for validation. Nothing. The camera was aimed forward, and the shoulder, 30 feet out, was just a blur of passing scrub. The mirrors, the witness, were useless. I told myself it was dehydration, a micro-sleep hallucination, a brain trying to make sense of the infinite monotony. But I knew what I saw. I saw something walking at 75 miles per hour. The next few runs were nerve-wracking. I avoided that route for 2 weeks, rerouting my schedule at significant cost. But the money was too good, and eventually, the logical part of my brain, the one that needed to pay the bills, beat out the terrified part. I took the gallop run again. This time, I was prepared. I mounted a small, cheap action camera on the passenger side door, aimed squarely at the rearview mirror and the shoulder. I was going to document this thing. It was day 18 since the first sighting. 2:45. Empty road. I was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't have to wait long. I felt the pressure, the invisible presence, and I checked the mirror. It was there. 40 feet back. But it had changed. Before, it had been tall and dark. Now, it was shorter, hunched, and its dark form was broken up. It looked like a person in filthy, light-colored rags, shuffling. Its head was down, obscured by what looked like long, dark hair or maybe a hood. It was still moving at my speed, 70 miles per hour, but the walking motion was replaced by a kind of low, desperate, stumbling shuffle. It looked like a person who had been walking for 1,000 years. I felt a surge of cold pity, immediately followed by the original dread. This wasn't a person. Whatever it was cosplaying as human suffering. I dictated notes into my voice recorder, keeping my eyes fixed on the mirror, describing its appearance in a detached, clinical tone, trying to hold on to the shred of sanity my professional log provided. It is mimicking human fatigue. Appearance is distressed, low to the ground, maintaining distance. It is aware I am watching. I decided to test it. I sped up to 80, then 85, then 90. My rig rattled, the engine screamed. I looked in the mirror. Still there. 40 feet. The distance never changed, no matter the speed. It was tethered to me. I slowed down abruptly to 45. It continued its stumbling shuffle, maintaining the perfect gap. Then I slowed to 20 miles per hour. It began to slow too, its shuffling gait becoming painfully drawn out, like a slow-motion video. Finally, I stopped. I pulled the air brake. Silence, save for the ticking of the cooling engine. I looked in the mirror. It stopped. 40 feet away. Still hunched, still obscured. It was just standing there, dark on the light gravel, perfectly still. I sat there, frozen, for a full minute. The silence of the desert night pressed in. I felt an overwhelming, powerful urge to turn off my headlights, turn off the engine, and just wait in the dark. The action camera I had mounted was recording everything. I could see the shape clearly on the small monitor I had placed next to the dash. I reached for the door handle, then hesitated. I didn't know if it was dangerous, but I knew, deep down, that getting out of the truck would be the end of me. I started the engine, put the rig in gear, and took off. As soon as I hit 50 miles per hour, the shape resumed its impossible tireless shuffle, 40 feet behind. For the next 4 hours, until the sun finally broke the horizon, I drove with that thing in my mirror. I stopped using my high beams. I didn't listen to the radio. I just drove, staring into the passenger mirror, watching the silhouette keep pace. And then, as the sky turned a pale, bruised purple, the third change occurred. It didn't look like a human anymore. It was still bipedal, but the form was now strangely distorted. It was massive, bulky, covered in what looked like shaggy, brown fur, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. No neck. It moved with a loping, heavy stride, the kind of movement you'd expect from a massive bear, yet it was still silent, still 40 feet back, still moving at highway speed. It looked like something primal, pulled straight from a campfire tale about the wilderness, but somehow, terrifyingly, it was on the side of a modern highway. As the sun hit the horizon, washing the desert in orange light, the thing simply faded. The edges dissolved, the mass became transparent, and it was gone. I pulled over and checked the footage. The action camera had malfunctioned. The lens was dusty, and the video was an overexposed, shaking mess of light and shadow, capturing nothing definitive, nothing that could convince a jury or a therapist. I started to break. I took 2 weeks off, told my dispatcher I was sick, and holed up in a cheap motel in Oklahoma City, drinking bad coffee and trying to rationalize what I had seen. I showed the blurred, useless footage to a friend, a former Marine turned mechanic. He just laughed and told me I needed a vacation. But the road called me back. It always does. The return to the Gallop Run was inevitable. This time, I was running on fear and adrenaline. I had the cab rigged up. I had 3 cameras running, front, back of the trailer, facing the shoulder, and the internal mirror camera. I had my voice recorder on, and I had a shotgun locked under my bunk. I was ready for a monster. But the night I took the route, day 35 since the first sighting, the entity was waiting. And this time, the changes were personal. It appeared not 40 feet back, but 70 feet. A change in the routine, a change in the rules. It was back to the tall, thin silhouette, but now, it was wearing a hat. A wide-brimmed felt hat, the kind my own father used to wear when he worked construction in the summers. And it was wearing a shirt, a pale, checked shirt that looked exactly like one I'd thrown away years ago, too threadbare to wear. It was holding something. A long, thin object that hung by its side as it walked. I zoomed the mirror camera in, pushing the resolution to its limits. The object wasn't a stick or a weapon. It was a fishing rod. A cheap, fiberglass spinning rod, the kind I used to carry in the storage compartment of my first truck. I slammed on the brakes again. This time, I went from 70 to a dead stop in seconds, the trailer protesting the rapid deceleration. I watched the mirror. The entity stopped too, now only maybe 50 feet back, due to my sudden stop. It stood still, the fishing rod hanging from its impossibly long hand. Then its hand moved. It didn't lift the rod to strike. It simply used the rod to point. And it wasn't pointing at me. It was pointing off the shoulder, deep into the dark, scrub-filled desert. A wave of profound, cold terror washed over me. This wasn't a creature of the wilderness. This was a creature that had been studying me. It had synthesized elements of my past, my memories, and my fears into its current form. It was learning how to communicate. And the communication was simple. Look over there. This is where you belong. I turned my head and looked into the darkness of the desert, where it was pointing. I saw nothing. Just the endless, oppressive darkness and the faint, cold shapes of the mesquite. But in my mind, a complete, horrifying picture formed, a shallow, lonely grave dug under the hot Arizona sun, with only the wind and the asphalt to witness it. I lost it. I screamed, a guttural, meaningless sound of pure fear, and hit the gas. I drove the rest of the night at maximum speed, never checking the mirrors again. My eyes fixed forward. I drove through the night, through the day, not stopping until I was 2 states away, in a crowded truck depot where the noise and the light made me feel momentarily safe. I quit the company the next day. I sold the truck, the cameras, everything. I never even reviewed the final footage. I wiped the hard drives clean. I couldn't bear to see the thing in the hat, holding the fishing rod. I live in a suburb now. I work a desk job. I have a small yard and a dog. But sometimes, when I'm driving home from the grocery store, stuck in traffic on a 6-lane interstate, I glance into my side mirror. And for a split second, in the narrow gap between my car and the concrete barrier, I see a long, dark shape. It is always there, maintaining the perfect distance. It's not moving at 70 miles per hour anymore. It's moving at 35 miles per hour, the speed of rush hour traffic. And I know the inhabitant of the road is still with me. It's just walking a little slower, a little closer to my reality, waiting for the day I decide to take one last, long, lonely ride. Story 3. The letter arrived 6 weeks after my great-aunt Alara passed, delivered by a small, impersonal legal firm in Seattle. I hadn't seen Alara since I was a child, a distant, eccentric figure who lived a hermetic life somewhere in the vast, dense acreage of the Pacific Northwest. The contents of the letter were simple. I was the sole heir to her modest estate, which consisted of a small, rustic cabin and the surrounding 53 acres of untouched timberland outside Forks, Washington. The lawyer stressed the word, remote. My name is Ethan Wells. I'm a city guy, a software developer who equates nature with a well-maintained urban park. But a free cabin and 53 acres of land, prime real estate, even that deep in the sticks, was too tempting to ignore. I quit my job, packed the bare necessities, and drove west, trading the relentless hum of the city for what I imagined would be profound, restorative silence. It was not restorative. The cabin sat at the end of a long, barely visible dirt track that required a four-wheel drive to navigate. It was a humble structure, built from rough-hewn cedar logs, nestled in a small, damp clearing. The massive, ancient Douglas firs towered around it, blocking out almost all sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight. The air was cold, wet, and smelled intensely of pine needles, wet earth, and something metallic, like old coins. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Or rather, the terrifying lack of it. In a forest that dense, you expect the cacophony of life: birds, squirrels, insects, wind. Here, there was only the damp, suffocating quiet. The wind didn't seem to blow through the canopy. It seemed to stop at the tops of the trees, leaving the ground level in a state of atmospheric compression. It was the deepest, most profound silence I had ever experienced, and it felt less like peace and more like a physical pressure on the eardrums. I named it internally, the silence of the pines. I spent the first 2 days just exploring the cabin. It was meticulously maintained, but filled with the relics of Alara's strange life. Shelves of unlabeled glass jars filled with dried herbs and blackened roots, a massive, unblinking taxidermy owl on the mantelpiece, and a collection of journals bound in cracked leather. The journals were the most disturbing. They were written in Alara's precise, looping script, but they weren't diaries. They were detailed observations of the forest, filled with cryptic notations, celestial charts, and detailed sketches of strange, non-native mosses and fungi. The margins were filled with symbols I didn't recognize, circles with intersecting lines, triangles, and a repeated glyph that looked like a distorted human eye. The more I read, the more the silence of the pines felt like a deliberate act, a ward put up by the forest itself. The first anomaly occurred on day 3. I was washing dishes in the small kitchen sink, looking out the single window at the wall of evergreens. I heard a sound, not loud, but clear, a single, sharp snap, like a heavy branch breaking. It came from deep within the forest, exactly where the silence was thickest. I dismissed it as a branch, a falling tree. But then, less than a minute later, I heard it again. Snap. Same volume, same intensity, but this time, it came from an entirely different direction, 90 degrees from the first. It continued for the next 20 minutes, a precise, mechanical snapping sound emanating from the depths of the pines, always singular, always isolated, and always coming from a new, random location. It wasn't the natural sound of a forest. It sounded like an endless, invisible entity was slowly, methodically stepping on dry sticks, marking the perimeter. I went cold. I locked the flimsy bolt on the front door and stared out the window until the light failed. As the days bled into weeks, the psychological assault began. The silence was the canvas, and the forest began to paint unsettling imagery. I began to find small, carefully arranged piles of stones on the property. Not just random rock piles, but perfectly stacked cairns, often 3 or 4 stones high, marking specific spots. One was by the back door, one at the mouth of the stream, and one, ominously, directly under the window of the room where I slept. They seemed to appear overnight, without any sound or disturbance. I tried to rationalize it. A survivalist? A local hiker? But the stones were always damp, even when the ground was dry. And when I checked the one outside my window, I noticed something sticking to the bottom stone. It was a single, long strand of dark, fine hair, too long to be mine, too fine to be animal fur. It felt like silk and smelled faintly of that metallic, acrid scent I had noted upon arrival. I started to read Alara's journals again, desperate for a clue. In one of the later, more frantic entries, she had sketched a map of the property, showing the stream, the clearings, and the cabin. Overlaying the map were the same glyphs I had seen before, the circles and the stylized eyes. Next to the sketch of the cabin, she had written a single, horrifying sentence. "The cairns are the teeth of the watcher. Do not feed them." The terror became less about a ghost and more about a system. Something deeply ingrained in the geography of the land, something my aunt had been studying, or perhaps serving. The cabin, my supposed sanctuary, became the most dangerous place of all. The air inside felt heavy, almost breathable, and when the faint light of day seeped in, I began to notice subtle shifts in the aesthetic. I started losing things. Not keys or wallets, but tiny, significant items. A silver ring I always wore, a specific photograph of my sister, a packet of sugar from the kitchen shelf. I would search for hours, eventually giving up. Then, a few days later, the item would reappear. Not where I left it, but in a place that made no sense. My silver ring, for example, was found dangling from the antler of the taxidermy owl. The photograph was placed face down on my pillow. The placement was deliberate, intimate, and profoundly violating. It suggested that the entity was not only observing my every move, but was also spending time in the cabin, handling my personal effects, trying on my life. The line between outside and inside was dissolving. The climax of the psychological terror came on a night of absolute, deafening rain. The sound of the downpour was the first time I'd heard any loud, sustained noise since arriving, and it was a welcome distraction. I was huddled near the small wood-burning stove, trying to read. Then, the rain noise changed. It didn't stop, but the sound of the rain hitting the roof, a solid, constant patter, began to be interrupted by a new, rhythmic sound directly above me. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like the drip of a leak, only faster, and coming from multiple, close-together spots. I grabbed my flashlight and looked up at the ceiling, an old, water-stained expanse of cedar planks. As I watched, a dark, wet stain began to appear, centered directly over the stove. The stain quickly grew, darkening the wood. And then, the sound from above changed again. It was no longer a drip. It was a faint, sucking, squelching sound, and the stain on the ceiling began to run. It wasn't water. It was a thick, black, viscous fluid that looked like old motor oil or solidified sap. It didn't drip. It flowed slowly, adhering to the wood. As it flowed, I saw a shape begin to form in the wet blackness on the ceiling, a smear that quickly solidified into a single, massive stylized eye, identical to the glyphs in my aunt's journal. I stood paralyzed, the light fixed on the ceiling. The eye wasn't reflecting light. It seemed to absorb it, a black void staring down at me. The squelching sound intensified, and the fluid began to drip, not in drops, but in slow, heavy threads falling like black, sticky rain towards the floor. In that moment, I understood what Alara had meant by the cairns. The pines were watching, and the entity was forcing its way into the cabin, pushing its physicality through the porous boundary of the wood itself. I didn't scream. I didn't run. The psychological dread was so profound that I felt an overwhelming sense of acceptance. This was it. I was going to be consumed by the forest's guardian. I stood there, waiting for the first drop to land on me. Then I heard another sound, one that broke the spell. The sudden, high-pitched, insistent ringing of my phone. It was my sister, calling from the city, worried because I hadn't returned a text message in 3 days. The sheer normalcy of the sound, the electronic chime of a modern device, was a jarring intrusion into the art house horror of the cabin. The sound shattered the tension. The black eye on the ceiling did not instantly vanish, but its edges began to waver, and the heavy dripping of the black fluid slowed. The squelching sound faded. The presence, the powerful sense of malice, seemed to recoil slightly, disturbed by the frequency of the external world. I snatched the phone, my hand shaking, and answered, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Hey, sorry, bad service. Everything's fine." As I spoke, keeping the phone pressed to my ear, the eye on the ceiling began to dissolve, slowly retreating back into the wood, leaving a massive, dark stain behind. The rain returned to its normal rhythm. I hung up, the silence returning, but it was no longer the oppressive void. It was just quiet. The entity had backed off. I stayed for 3 more weeks, but the spirit of the place had changed. The snapping sounds continued, but less frequently. The stones still appeared, but they seemed less deliberate, less accusatory. I knew the entity was still there, still watching, but the experience had given me a terrifying truth. I was not its target, I was its replacement. My aunt had been the watcher, the recorder, the servant of the system. The cabin was a lighthouse, and I was the new keeper. I left on day 45. I didn't sell the land. I put a padlock on the front door, leaving everything, the furniture, the journals, the taxidermy owl, exactly where it was. I drove away, never looking in the rearview mirror. I never told anyone the full story. But every night, when the city lights are off and the air conditioning is humming, I sometimes think I hear it, a faint, rhythmic, snapping sound, like an invisible entity marking the perimeter, always a little closer than the night before. I know that the silence of the pines is waiting, and that one day, I will be compelled to go back and take up my aunt's terrifying ledger. The cabin demands a keeper. Story 4. The medical complex was a monument to bureaucratic irony. Built in 2018 on the site of the notorious Blackwood State Lunatic Asylum, the same asylum that had operated under appalling conditions for 80 years before its closure in 1971. The new structure was a sterile, glass and steel temple to modern wellness. Clean lines, open spaces, and fluorescent lights that never quite reached the corners. My name is Sam Rivers, and I was the graveyard shift security chief. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I was the sole living soul in a building designed for thousands. They called it the third shift anomaly in the company logs because, as I would soon discover, that was when the place came alive. My job was simple: monitor the CCTV feeds, log the fire and alarm systems, and do 2 walking patrols, one at 1 a.m. and one at 4 a.m. The money was great because the isolation was immense. I liked the silence. It was predictable. Until it wasn't. My command center was a small, windowless office on the ground floor. I had banks of monitors showing every hallway, every entrance, every pristine, empty waiting area. It was an environment of maximum visibility, yet minimum life. The first 6 weeks were dull. The only activity was the occasional HVAC noise, a settling creak, or the inevitable phantom alarm from a dusty smoke detector. But around the beginning of December, the anomalies began. It started with the motion sensors. The complex was rigged with highly sensitive, laser-based sensors in every hallway. Around 2:30, in the long, surgical wing corridor on the second floor, an area absolutely off-limits and sealed after 7 p.m., a sensor would trip. Alert, Zone B2, Corridor 3 motion. I'd check the camera. The corridor was empty. A white, long, silent expanse of polished linoleum. I'd watch the feed for 5 minutes, then reset the alarm. It would trip again 5 minutes later. Alert, Zone B2, Corridor 3 motion. I ran through the logical possibilities. Rodent? The place was hermetically sealed. Faulty wiring? The maintenance crew had checked it twice. Residual heat? Unlikely given the centralized temperature control. It was illogical, but the logs were undeniable. Over 3 nights, Corridor 3 tripped 56 times, always between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. I began my own investigation. On my 1 a.m. patrol, I walked the surgical corridor. It felt normal. Cool, quiet, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic cleaner. But as I passed the sealed operating rooms, I distinctly heard a sound from within one of the rooms. A faint tinkling sound, like ceramic hitting ceramic. A sound too light to trip the motion sensor, but too clear to be dismissed as a creak. It sounded exactly like a single, dropped scalpel hitting a porcelain tray. I tried the door. Locked. I radioed my findings to the recorder I kept on my belt, keeping my voice low and calm. Patrol 1, Corridor 3, audible anomaly. Possible mechanical noise within or 7. No visual confirmation. Continuing patrol. The next week, the activity moved to the sub-basement, the deepest part of the facility, which contained the archives and the old boiler room, the only part of the new complex built directly over the foundations of the old asylum's main wing. The sub-basement cameras showed something truly inexplicable. A bank of old, heavy-duty shelving, stacked high with sealed patient records, would suddenly, violently, vibrate. The shelves themselves, secured to the floor and walls, would shudder for 2 or 3 seconds, causing the file boxes to rattle loudly. The movement was captured by the camera, but the motion sensors in the room did not trip. It was a paradox: high vibration, but zero displacement. The energy was localized, powerful, and specifically designed to rattle the records. I spent an hour down there, setting up a specialized acoustic sensor, a high-gain mic meant to capture infrasound. As I was working, crouched behind a ventilation duct, I heard the sound that confirmed the malice of the place. A noise that had no place in the world of metal and glass. It was a faint, wavering cry, like a child weeping. It was thin, high, and steeped in a terrible, historical sorrow. It wasn't loud, but the acoustic sensor instantly peaked, registering the sound with incredible clarity. I knew it wasn't the sound of a living child. It was a pure, emotional echo of the location's horrific past. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding, and locked myself back in the command center. The entity had found its voice. The incidents began to increase in frequency and power, now escalating to full-blown poltergeist activity, perfectly documented by my high-tech surveillance network. Event 1: The Wheelchair. 3:15, Day 42. In the main lobby, where several wheelchairs were stored against a wall, one of them, a standard aluminum model, began to move. Slowly at first, it rolled out from the wall, then accelerated sharply, rolling across the wide, marble floor. It didn't roll straight. It rolled in a jerky, erratic zigzag pattern, as if being roughly pushed by someone learning how to steer it. The camera captured the entire event. The chair stopped only when it slammed into the reinforced glass front door, leaving a mark on the pristine surface. The motion sensor logged a large, fast-moving object. I watched the footage 5 times. The wheelchair moved against gravity on a flat surface, with no visible source of propulsion. Event 2: The Hall of Lights. 4 o'clock, Day 43. During my 4 a.m. patrol, I was in a long, unoccupied hallway on the 3rd floor. As I walked, the high-efficiency fluorescent light fixtures directly above my head began to flicker and explode in sequence, one by one. Pew 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 pew. The shatter of glass and the smell of ozone followed me like a personalized wave of darkness. The noise was deafening in the sterile silence. The entity was not just moving objects, it was manipulating the electrical energy around me, making a targeted, high-energy threat. I ran. Event 3: The Door. 2 o'clock, Day 45. The most violent event. I was watching the camera feed from the 2nd floor staff lounge. The room was empty. Suddenly, the interior door leading to the supply closet, a heavy, fire-rated door, flew open with incredible force, hitting the wall with a thunderous crack. It then slammed shut. Open. Slam. Open. Slam. It repeated this movement for exactly 10 seconds, the motion blurred and violent, before stopping abruptly. When I checked the physical door later, the heavy doorstop had been ripped out of the concrete floor. The entity was throwing a tantrum. I realized the logic of the entity. It wasn't a standard haunting. It was a poltergeist of contempt. It hated the new, clean, modern building built on the ruins of its torment, and it was using the building's own high-tech infrastructure to attack it. My command center became the focus. I had documented too much. Day 50. 3:30. I was editing the latest footage, trying to compress the explosion of the lights into a coherent report, when the air in my small office plummeted in temperature. I looked at the thermometer I kept on my desk, 58 degrees, dropping fast. Then, the low-frequency acoustic sensor I had placed in the sub-basement archives began to emit a deep, rhythmic thrumming sound, a sound so low it felt less like hearing and more like an internal vibration in my chest. The computer monitors flickered, the images stretching and distorting. On the screen showing the main staircase, a figure began to move up the stairs. It wasn't an invisible shadow or a thermal anomaly. It was a thick, black, oily smear that adhered to the railing, pulling itself up the stairs with a slow, laborious movement. It was formless yet purposeful. It looked like a column of congealed smoke, determined to reach the top. I grabbed the internal phone to call the facility manager, but the line was dead. The emergency line. Dead. The thrumming from the sub-basement became an overwhelming roar. The walls of my small office began to vibrate, and the light above my head shattered, plunging the room into the emergency light's sickly, orange glow. I looked at the staircase feed. The black mass was on the second-floor landing. It was coming for me. I made the final dictation into my recorder, my voice a whisper above the growing, internal roar. Day 50, 3:45. The anomaly has achieved full physical manifestation. High-energy poltergeist activity. Entity appears to be advancing. It is a creature of noise and historical hatred, focused on disruption and the destruction of the sterile environment. I am abandoning the command post. I didn't run out the front door. I ran to the back exit, the one leading to the loading dock, which was locked from the inside. I threw the deadbolt and used my electronic keycard. As I fumbled with the keycard reader, the metal fire door directly behind me began to dent. Not creak, not rattle, but visibly warp inward, a massive, unseen force pressing against the steel. The sound was a grating, tortured shriek of metal, the screws holding the frame beginning to pop out of the wall. I got the door open, threw myself out onto the loading dock, and slammed the steel door shut. I didn't stop to breathe. I ran until I reached the chain link fence, scrambled over it, and kept running down the street until I was blocks away. I never went back for my personal effects, my uniform, or the surveillance logs. I simply called the facility manager from a payphone and told him I quit, effective immediately, citing the inhuman working conditions. I later heard the official report blamed multiple electrical surges and unspecified foundational issues for the damage. They found the heavy, steel fire door on the loading dock bent inward, the metal frame severely warped, and the screws scattered like shrapnel. I now work security in a brightly lit busy mall. The noise is overwhelming, the people are annoying, but the surveillance cameras never show anything but the normal chaos of commerce. But sometimes, when I'm walking through the fluorescent lit aisles, I glance up at a fixture, and I feel a sudden, intense drop in temperature. And I hear the faintest, almost inaudible tinkling sound, like a scalpel hitting porcelain, a quiet promise from the anomaly that it remembers its observer. Story 5. The listing was impossible to resist. A 1920s farmhouse on 10 acres in upstate New York, listed at a price that screamed. Hidden problem. My name is David, and I'm a carpenter by trade, a restless soul by nature. I bought the place, sight unseen, with the intention of flipping it. The house, named the Homestead by the previous owners, was a 2-story wood frame structure, weathered gray, with a massive, dilapidated barn standing sentinel nearby. It was surrounded by endless, lonely fields, the kind of quiet that feels like the world has ended just beyond your property line. The hidden problem wasn't structural, it was emotional. When I first walked in, the air was immediately heavy, not with dust, but with a profound, suffocating grief. The house was stripped bare, but the feeling remained, a palpable, aching sadness that felt less like an atmosphere and more like a permanent tenant. I'm not a believer in ghosts, but I am a believer in energy, and the homestead was saturated with a kind of concentrated sorrow that immediately took up residence in my own chest. I started the renovation methodically, working 12-hour days, tearing out the rotted plaster, replacing joists, and gutting the kitchen. My objective was to modernize the structure, but the house seemed to resist my efforts, not with physical obstacles, but with psychological fatigue. On day 3, as I was tearing out the old cabinetry, I was suddenly, inexplicably, overwhelmed by a wave of crushing guilt. It was instantaneous and violent, a feeling so strong it made my knees buckle. I felt as if I had committed an unforgivable crime, a betrayal of monumental proportions. I dropped my tools, sat on the dusty floor, and wept for 10 minutes, a deep, wrenching, inconsolable sob, for a sin I hadn't committed. The moment I stood up, the feeling lifted, leaving me shaken and completely bewildered. I logged it in my notebook. 11:45 a.m. Extreme, unprovoked emotional episode. Suggestion of deep, internalized guilt. Duration 10 minutes. Cause unknown. Note: maintain professional distance. I realized then that the house was a conduit for a singular, powerful emotion, and whatever lived here wasn't a classical, rattling spirit. It was an entity of pure, tragic empathy, desperate to share its enduring pain. The phenomenon escalated, always centered on my personal emotional state. I'd be working in the attic, measuring the rafters, and suddenly be engulfed by a fierce, protective love, a powerful, almost painful desire to sacrifice everything for a child I didn't have. I'd walk through the living room, and a wave of raw, violent anger would strike, so potent I'd have to fight the urge to throw a hammer through the nearest window. The house was forcing me to feel the archived, high-intensity emotions of its former inhabitant. I began researching the house's history, pulling records from the local library. The homestead had been owned by the Miller family for decades. The last occupant was a farmer named Thomas Miller. The records were sparse, but a few old newspaper clippings detailed a single, tragic event. Thomas's 7-year-old daughter, Sarah, had died in the winter of 1953 from an unspecified illness, and Thomas had subsequently committed suicide in the barn 3 weeks later. The death was ruled a despair-driven hanging. I looked up at the rafters of my own house. The weight of Thomas's despair suddenly felt physically present. The entity of the house, which I now mentally referred to as Thomas, wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to communicate its tragedy. It was a silent, emotional possession. The communication became more physical, though always subtle. I started leaving my keys in specific, clean places. In the morning, they would be on the floor, but not thrown. They would be neatly placed next to my work boot, but slightly damp, as if they had been gripped by a sweating hand for a long time. In the master bedroom, where I was tearing up the floorboards, I found an old, faded child's drawing tucked under the subfloor. It was a crude sketch of a man, a woman, and a small girl with 2 pigtails. A family. I placed the drawing on the mantelpiece, thinking that if the spirit wanted it seen, I would comply. The next morning, the drawing was gone. I searched everywhere. It was completely gone. But in the dust where it had been, there was a single, perfect fingerprint, a clear, whorled imprint of a large thumb, pressed deeply into the accumulated dust. This time, the emotional wave that hit me was not guilt or anger, but a profound, gut-wrenching loss, a feeling of absolute, final bereavement that made the air feel thin and unbreathable. I fell to my knees, gasping, experiencing the moment Thomas must have felt when he realized his daughter was gone forever. I understood the connection. The ghost was the trauma, not the person. Thomas's spirit was so intertwined with his grief that the house itself became a vessel for his unending pain. I moved my focus to the barn, hoping the change in location would provide a break. The barn was massive, dark, and filled with the dust of 70 years. It was where Thomas had taken his life, and the energy there was 100 times heavier than the house. The silence was punctuated by a continuous, low groaning sound, not wind, but the sound of massive, unsupported weight. I walked to the center of the barn, near the old winch and loft access. And then I saw the rope. Hanging from the thickest crossbeam, high up in the rafters, was a length of frayed, dry hemp rope, tied into a noose. It was old, brittle, and coated in dust, but it was unquestionably a suicide knot, exactly where the records said Thomas had died. I hadn't seen it before. I was certain. I had walked this same spot 2 days prior. The rope was a physical manifestation, a pure expression of Thomas's final moment, presented to me with a kind of desperate, theatrical urgency. The wave of despair that followed was immediate and total. It wasn't just sadness. It was nihilism, the complete, logical conviction that life was a mistake, a brutal, pointless exercise in suffering. I stood beneath the rope, staring up, and heard a whisper that was not a sound, but a thought planted directly in my mind. It ends the wait. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to climb the stack of hay bales, grab the rope, and end the feeling. The sheer relief of release. I took one step toward the bales. Then I felt a new emotion, the sudden, cold clarity of fear. Not my fear, but the fear of the person who had been there before Thomas died. I felt the sudden, frantic terror of his wife, the realization that she was about to find him, the rush of cold air as she opened the barn doors. The house was showing me the last minutes of Thomas's life, but this time, from the perspective of a terrified bystander. The two emotions, Thomas's suicidal peace and his wife's paralyzing terror, collided in my chest with the force of a physical blow, and I doubled over, gasping for air. I backed out of the barn, stumbling through the heavy dust, fighting the mental noise. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just renovate the physical structure. I had to renovate the tragedy. I went back to the house, grabbed my ladder and a heavy-duty box cutter, and marched back to the barn. My hands were shaking, but the guilt was now replaced by a fierce determination. I climbed the bales, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure adrenaline. When I reached the rope, I didn't hesitate. I sliced through the old hemp with a single, violent stroke. The rope fell, a dull thud in the silent, dusty air. The moment the rope hit the ground, the deep, low groaning of the barn stopped. The oppressive weight in the air lifted. The feeling of despair receded, leaving behind a cold, empty echo. The house hadn't been attacking me. It had been begging to be released from the final act of its tragedy. I found the little girl's drawing later that day. It was not on the mantelpiece. It was taped neatly, with a piece of old masking tape, to the inside of the front door, facing outward. A sign of completion. I finished the renovation quickly. The emotional attacks ceased entirely. The house was now just a house, old, creaky, but neutral. The weight was gone. I sold the homestead 3 months later for a significant profit, never telling the young family who bought it about Thomas or Sarah. They talked about the peaceful quiet and the beautiful fields. I bought a new house, closer to the city, and returned to my normal, emotionally flat existence. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my workshop, the air in the room will suddenly feel thick and heavy. And a single, powerful wave of intense, bittersweet gratitude will wash over me, making my eyes sting with unshed tears. It lasts only a second, a gentle, powerful touch of emotion that is not my own. I know it's Thomas. He's just checking in, a ghost of relief, a final, grateful burden lifted from the heavy rafters of his old home. Story 6. Our annual trip into the backcountry of Montana's Glacier National Park was supposed to be a detox, a chance to trade screen time for campfire smoke, corporate nonsense for mountain air. There were 4 of us, myself, Nick, the organizer, Mark, the perpetual skeptic, Chris, the easygoing tech guy, and Dave, the one who worried about everything. We were experienced hikers, well equipped, and 3 days deep into the wilderness, miles from any trail or signal. The first few days were perfect. Challenging climbs, clear skies, and that sense of profound, physical fatigue that feels so good. Then came the sound. It was the 3rd night, about 1 a.m. We were asleep in our tents in a small, remote clearing near a glacial lake. The silence had been total, the kind of stillness where you can hear the blood rushing in your ears. Then the sound. It was a deep, resonating thump, like a heavy log hitting a hollow earth drum. It was too low to be an animal, too rhythmic to be a falling rock, and it came from the thick tree line directly north of our camp. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Thump. It continued for 5 minutes, relentless and perfectly timed, like a giant, invisible metronome. It wasn't threatening, but it was undeniably unnatural. Mark, the skeptic, was the first to speak, his voice muffled by the tent fabric. Bear territory? Something big out there. Bears don't do that, I whispered back. That's not a paw print. That's a deliberate beat. The sound stopped as abruptly as it began. We lay there for an hour, listening to the returned silence, our hearts pounding. We settled on the most rational explanation, a massive boulder, slowly settling under the pressure of the meltwater. The next morning, day 4, we broke camp and headed east, following the game trail deeper into the high meadow. The oddity began when we stopped for lunch. Chris noticed it first. He was trying to light his portable stove. "Hey, did anyone bring an extra canister of fuel?" We looked at him. "You had 2 full ones, Chris," I said. "I saw you pack them." He checked his pack again. "Yeah, I know. But there's only one here now. And this one feels half empty." We looked at the stove. It was sputtering, clearly low on fuel. We were 2 days from our cash point. It was a problem, but not a disaster. We were all experienced enough to manage on less. We chalked it up to a packing mistake. Later that afternoon, we hit the stream, the one marked on my old, faded topographical map. The stream was supposed to be a trickle that fed into the lake. But when we reached it, it was a raging, fast-moving torrent, almost a river, much too wide and powerful to cross easily. "This is wrong," Dave said, his brow furrowed with genuine worry. "The map says 3 feet wide. This is 10. And the water level should be down this time of year." We spent an hour backtracking, trying to find a safer crossing point, eventually losing 2 hours of daylight. That night the rhythmic thump returned, this time closer, more resonant, coming from the west. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Thump. We lay awake, listening to the unsettling beat until the cold dawn finally broke the rhythm. On day 5, the truly terrifying part began, the loop. We woke up, packed our gear, and headed north, deciding to try to climb out of the valley and onto the ridge. We hiked for 3 hours, hard and fast, moving through dense undergrowth. We stopped for a break near a cluster of 3 distinctively shaped, white-barked aspens. Mark leaned against one, pulled out a protein bar, and paused. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice flat. "Didn't we stop here yesterday?" We looked around. The 3 aspens were striking, a single, massive trunk split into 2, with a third, younger tree growing perfectly between them, creating a narrow, vertical aperture. "No, we stopped near the stream yesterday," I argued. "No, I mean yesterday morning," Mark insisted. "Before we had the fuel issue. We stopped right here. I had my bar, a peanut butter one." He checked his wrappers. "Today, I've got the chocolate chip." Chris, the pragmatic one, walked over to a nearby, moss-covered boulder. He picked something up. It was a crumpled, empty peanut butter protein bar wrapper. A cold knot formed in my chest. We had hiked north for 3 hours. We should have been miles away. Yet, here we were, at the exact spot we had been the day before. We hadn't been walking in a circle. We had been walking in a linear repetition. We were trapped in a geographical loop, a temporal distortion orchestrated by the thump from the night before. Panic began to set in, but I forced us to stay calm. "We backtrack," I ordered. "We go back to camp." We reset. We reversed course, hiking as fast as we could. We reached the camp clearing in 2 hours. But when we got there, the camp was gone. No packed tents, no cold fire pit, no scattered remnants. The ground was untouched, covered in damp pine needles, as if no one had ever camped there. We had clearly been there. We knew the landmarks. But the physical evidence of our stay, tents, cooking gear, the leveled earth, had been erased. "It's resetting," Dave whispered, his face pale. "The forest is resetting our track." The sheer, cosmic horror of it was devastating. We weren't lost. We were being rerun, like a failed segment of a film. We hiked away from the spot, terrified. We were hungry, low on water, and mentally unraveling. We started arguing, the stress tearing away at our friendly facade. That night, we dared not sleep. We huddled by a tiny, flickering fire, listening. The sound returned, but this time, it was accompanied by something new. The low, deep thump was still there, coming from the east, but layered over it was a faint, human whisper. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I knew. It was a fluid, clicking, sibilant sound, almost like a massive insect humming a sequence of words. It was coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight, and it was getting closer. The whisper wasn't a threat, it was a narration. I turned on my headlamp, shining the beam into the dark. I saw nothing, but the beam illuminated a small, low-hanging branch of a fir tree right on the edge of the light. And there, dangling from the branch, was a single, used canister of stove fuel. It was the one Chris had lost 2 days ago. It was deliberately placed, like a prop waiting for its cue. The entity was not only looping our movements, it was setting the stage for the next performance, putting the props back in place for the rerun. The next morning, day 6, we had descended into a terrified paranoia. We started hiking, and within an hour, we encountered the raging stream. "Wait!" I shouted, stopping the group. "This is it. The stream from day 4. It's too high. We have to go back." Dave, who had been silent for hours, stepped forward. His eyes were wide and strangely blank. "No, Nick. This is wrong. You're missing the key element. You have to go through it this time." "What are you talking about, Dave? We can't cross that. It's lethal." Dave didn't look at me. He looked at the water. "It needs the crossing. It needs the fuel loss, then the crossing, then the thump. The sequence has been established. If we break the sequence, it gets angry." He sounded completely detached, his voice echoing the rhythm of the thump we had heard. He had been possessed by the narrative of the loop. I realized with chilling clarity that the whispers hadn't just been a sound, they had been an instruction, and Dave had been the one who had internalized it. He took another step toward the raging torrent. "It needs a sacrifice to complete the loop," he said, staring at the water with a bizarre reverence. I lunged forward and grabbed his backpack, pulling him back from the edge. He fought me with a surprising, frantic strength, his face contorted in a silent snarl of frustration. "No! You're ruining the story!" he screamed, his voice no longer Dave's, but a harsh, gravelly sound. It was in that moment, in the chaos of the struggle, that I broke the loop. I didn't fight the narrative with logic. I fought it with a raw, unpredictable action. I grabbed the heavy metal water bottle from my pack and hurled it into the raging stream. It hit the water and was immediately dragged under the surface, disappearing instantly. Dave stopped struggling, his eyes slowly losing their blankness. He looked around, confused. "Nick? What are we doing here?" We stood there, breathing hard, exhausted. The immense, geological pressure of the narrative, the suffocating presence of the thump, was gone. The air felt normal again, cold, crisp, and filled with the ordinary sounds of the wild. The stream, which had been a raging torrent moments ago, was now exactly as the map described, a quiet, trickling brook, 3 feet wide, easy to cross. The entity had backed off, defeated not by force, but by a forced change in the script. We got out of that valley as fast as we could, hiking through the night, talking about everything but the silence. I never hike in the woods anymore. I have a genuine, debilitating phobia of wilderness areas. I live in a high-rise in Chicago, surrounded by the beautiful, loud chaos of the city. But sometimes, when a garbage truck outside hits a pothole in the dead of night, I hear a faint, low thump. And I look at my watch. It's always 1 a.m. I know the entity is out there, in the lonely, vast forests, resetting its script, waiting for a new cast. I only hope that whatever poor soul stumbles into that valley is unpredictable enough to break the loop. Story 7. My apartment building in the East Village of Manhattan is a relic, pre-war, 5 stories, with narrow, creaking stairs and an elevator that smells of old oil and existential dread. I'm a remote technical writer, and my entire existence revolves around the claustrophobic space of my 400 square foot walk-up. The apartment is small, but it's mine. Or at least, it used to be. This is a story not about a ghost haunting a house, but about something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more terrifying, an entity trying to wear me like a suit. It started subtly, with the relentless, grinding fatigue of a severe insomnia that settled over me like a concrete blanket. I wasn't just tired, I was drained, like something was siphon-feeding from my nervous system while I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The insomnia turned into full-blown sleep paralysis, where I would wake up in the dead of night, locked in my own body, watching the darkness with wide, terrified eyes. During these episodes, I started seeing the first signs of the tenant. It wasn't a spectral figure. It was a shift in the air, a shimmering distortion that would gather in the darkest corner of the room, near the closet. It looked like a heat haze on a summer road, but it radiated cold. It would slowly, methodically, creep across the floor, stopping inches from my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, but I could feel it, a cold, heavy pressure, like a massive hand pressing down on my chest. Then, the pressure would lift, and I would gasp myself back into movement, covered in a cold, metallic-smelling sweat. I tried everything: sleep hygiene, therapy, white noise, even a low dose of prescription sleeping pills. Nothing worked. The tenant was immune to modern medicine. As the physical drain continued, the subtle signs of substitution began. I am an obsessive coffee drinker. I detest tea, especially Earl Grey, which I find cloyingly floral and weak. One morning, I woke up, walked into the kitchen, and found a brand new, half-empty box of Earl Grey tea bags on the counter. I threw them out, assuming my neighbor had left them by accident. The next day, they were back. A different, unopened box, sitting next to my espresso machine. I was certain I hadn't bought them. Then came the food. I hate cilantro. It tastes like soap to me. I ordered takeout one night, a simple pad thai. When I opened the box, it was absolutely smothered in fresh cilantro leaves. I called the restaurant, furious. The manager checked the order. I hadn't specified. No cilantro. But I never did, because I never ordered anything that used it. The bag also contained a small, handwritten note that simply said, "Try new things." The terror was in the implication. Someone was subtly altering my routines, my habits, my personality, while I slept. The entity wasn't just in the room. It was influencing the very fabric of my existence. I started to check my banking records. No large, strange purchases, but several tiny, inexplicable ones: a subscription to a niche gardening magazine, a specific type of expensive, vintage fountain pen, and a book of obscure 19th century poetry. None of these were my interests, but they were all things that were slowly appearing in my apartment. The entity was building a new identity using my credit card, a kind of ghost in the machine of my life. I confronted my own reflection. I looked tired, yes, but there was a new expression on my face, a kind of detached, almost amused smirk that was utterly foreign. I would catch myself saying strange things in conversation, esoteric references to botany or philosophy that I didn't possess the knowledge to make. I was becoming an unwelcome host to a parasitic mind. The emotional shift was the most chilling part. I am generally an even-keeled, private person, but I began to experience flashes of intense, unprovoked arrogance, a deep-seated contempt for my friends and family. I would send harsh, cutting emails, only to look at them the next morning and realize they were written in a style that was technically mine, but emotionally alien. I realized the tenant was not only draining my life force but was also slowly, methodically, destroying my relationships to isolate me further, ensuring that when the transition was complete, no one would notice the subtle difference in the new me. The final, total breach occurred on a Tuesday. I was in the small bathroom, shaving, looking at the exhausted man in the mirror. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hot water run. When I opened them, the man in the mirror was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, unnervingly still, and showed too much teeth. It was the same detached, amused smirk I had seen before, but this time, it was impossible to ignore. I stared at the reflection, my razor frozen mid-shave. "Stop it," I whispered. The reflection's lips parted slightly, and it whispered back, but the sound was not coming from its mouth. It was a cold, dry thought planted in my head. "Your hands are much better than mine. I appreciate the upgrade." I dropped the razor, the clatter echoing in the small bathroom. I backed away, my heart hammering. The tenant wasn't just a shadow or an influence anymore. It was in the circuitry of my perception, actively speaking through the medium of my reflection. For the next 10 minutes, I watched the mirror. My physical body was trembling with terror, but the face in the glass was calm, smiling, its eyes, my eyes, filled with a serene, terrifying confidence. The reflection raised a finger and slowly, deliberately, drew a small, intricate glyph on the foggy glass. It was the same stylized human eye I had seen drawn on the napkin next to the tea bags. I shattered the mirror with the heel of my boot, scattering glass and fear across the tile. The immediate effect was liberating. The smiling reflection was gone. The overwhelming sense of an alien presence in my skull receded. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a new, terrifying sound, a low, resonant humming, coming from inside the walls of the apartment, a soft, electronic vibration that never stopped. I packed a single duffel bag. I didn't care about the clothes, the books, or the computer. I grabbed only my passport and my phone. I didn't lock the door behind me. I just walked out, leaving the life the tenant was so meticulously cultivating behind. I am now in a small, windowless office building on the other side of the country, working a simple, non-digital job, paying cash for a cheap room. I never use the internet for personal matters, and I only communicate with my sister through burner phones. But I know the tenant is still there, in my old apartment, enjoying its new life. I know because sometimes, when I see a stray cat on the street, or a random flower in a concrete crack, I feel a sudden, unbidden wave of profound interest in gardening. I find myself humming a strange, archaic melody I don't recognize. And every morning, when I wake up, I have to fight the overwhelming, almost debilitating desire to drink a calming cup of Earl Grey tea. It's just a little piece of the tenant, a small, subtle residue it left behind, waiting for the day I'm tired enough to open the door and invite the rest of its personality back in. The parasite is patient. Story 8. I'm a commercial saturation diver, trained for the extreme. My work isn't about tropical reefs, it's about cold, black, crushing pressure. My name is Alex, and my office is 300 feet below the surface. When the call came for the deep water salvage operation, retrieving a centuries-old steam engine component from a collapsed mine shaft flooded by the Great Lakes, the money was life-changing. But the job itself was death-defying. We established a base in an old industrial warehouse near the shoreline, running a specialized diving bell and a life support system. The target was a vertical shaft descending nearly 400 feet, then connecting to a horizontal tunnel network. The water was near freezing, opaque with glacial sediment, and absolutely, profoundly dark. The first few dives were brutal. The water was so thick, my 1,000-watt helmet lamp barely pierced 10 feet. I was working almost entirely by feel, guided only by the coarse radio feedback from my topside team. The atmosphere was one of total sensory deprivation, no sound except the hiss of my own regulator, no light except the cone on my helmet, and a pressure that felt like the entire world was pressing down on my skull. It was during the third descent, when I was fully submerged in the vertical shaft, that I had my first anomaly of the deep. I was hanging suspended on my umbilical, 30 feet above the tunnel mouth, when I heard something in my helmet that wasn't the radio. A sound, faint and distorted, like the scraping of metal on rock. It was rhythmic and close, right outside my visible light cone. I froze, heart pounding against the thick rubber of my dry suit. "Topside, this is Alex. Did you log that?" The voice of my supervisor, Mark, crackled back. "Negative, Alex. Just the regular hum of your umbilical feed. Everything nominal on our end." "What are you hearing?" "A scraping sound. Metal. Close by. Sounds like a tool being dragged." Mark was skeptical. "Probably just resonance. Shaft acoustics are weird. Proceed with caution." I descended slowly, trying to locate the source. The scraping continued, following the arc of my light, always just out of view. It was not resonance, it was intelligent, directed movement. It sounded exactly like the sound of a miner's pick or a shovel being dragged along the stone floor. I reached the tunnel entrance and stopped. The sound ceased immediately. Silence returned, heavy and cold. For the next 4 hours, I worked in the claustrophobic horizontal tunnel, securing rigging to the massive engine component. The pressure was immense, the cold seeped into my core, and the silence was a constant, screaming tension. I was so focused on the task that I forgot the scraping, until I turned to look behind me. In the faint, diffuse light that reflected off the shaft wall, I saw a shape. It was huge, massive, and impossibly close. It was the silhouette of a man, defined only by the slight absence of light it created. It was standing maybe 10 feet away, leaning against the rock face. It wasn't a shark, not a fish, and not a physical object. It was a distortion in the deep, opaque water, a column of absolute, light-devouring darkness shaped like a man. I didn't panic, thanks only to my saturation training, which forces a professional, methodical response. I slowly, deliberately, turned my helmet to aim the light directly at the figure. The beam hit the shape, and it immediately began to dissolve. It didn't swim away. It simply fragmented, the edges softening, the darkness dissipating into the murky water like a cloud of ink. Topside, I have a visual. Unknown entity. Large, non-organic form. Dispersing now. Mark's voice was tight with concern. Alex, ascend immediately. We are pulling you up. I was already ascending, reeling in the slack of my umbilical. I looked down one last time before leaving the tunnel. Where the shape had stood, the water was no longer just murky. It was a churning, black and white vortex of silt, violently disturbed, as if something massive had erupted from the tunnel floor. I was brought to the surface, put through decompression, and taken out of the bell. I looked physically fine, but I was emotionally shattered. I showed the topside video feed, a blur of silt and the sudden darkening of the water. The team blamed nitrogen narcosis, a temporary hallucination caused by pressure. I knew better. The entity was not a ghost of the water. It was a ghost of the mine, a residual echo of the human labor and death that had occurred there a century ago. I was the only one they trusted to finish the job. The money was still life-changing. I agreed to one last, final descent. The next day, I descended with a new, reinforced mental barrier. I was going to be a camera, a recording device, nothing more. The moment I entered the shaft, the feeling of pressure returned, but it wasn't just physical. It was psychological pressure, a wave of deep, debilitating exhaustion and sorrow that was not my own. I felt the profound weight of a miner's life, cold, dark, endless labor, and the certainty of a premature death. I reached the tunnel. This time, there was no scraping. There was singing. A low, melancholic, haunting chorus of male voices, coming from the depths of the tunnel, echoing through the dense water. It was a traditional Appalachian mining lament, the melody faint but perfectly recognizable. The voices were raw, filled with pain, and entirely out of place in my electronic helmet. Topside, I hear multiple voices. Low frequency. Singing. They are close. Alex, we hear only your regulator. Nothing on the acoustic sensor. Get out of there. That's a final order, Mark shouted. But I couldn't move. The singing had a hypnotic, powerful pull. I felt a compelling desire to join them, to walk down the tunnel, deeper into the darkness, and lend my voice to their sorrow. I forced myself to move, activating the cutting torch on the massive iron component. The bright, blinding flash of the torch momentarily broke the spell, searing the darkness. As the flame cut the metal, the voices became a unified scream, a piercing, desperate cry of outrage and pain that filled my helmet, drowning out the hiss of my own breathing. The physical sensation was immediate, a sudden, powerful shove against my chest, throwing me against the cold rock wall of the tunnel. The impact was real, a brutal, jarring blow that knocked the air out of my lungs. I was spun around, my umbilical snagged on a protrusion. I was momentarily blind, my lamp pointed uselessly at the rock face. I was trapped. I was in a zero visibility, high pressure, underwater panic. I felt the shape again. The immense, light-devouring presence was inches from my back, pressing me against the stone. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, a thermal deficit so extreme it was painful even through the dry suit. I heard the sound again, but this time, it was a sound of pure, final triumph, the distinct, heavy thud of a collapsing roof beam, the sound that must have ended the lives of the men whose voices I had just heard. In a desperate, last-ditch effort, I did the only thing I could do. I jettisoned my heavyweight belt. The sudden, violent shift in my buoyancy ripped me free from the snagged umbilical. I ascended instantly, pulled by the slack in the line. I shot up the shaft like a rocket, leaving the mine tunnel, the song, and the entity of pressure behind. I made it to the surface, was pulled out of the water, and survived the slow decompression. I was physically fine, but my dry suit was severely ripped across the back, near the shoulder, a tear consistent with massive, localized force. I never went back. I quit deep-sea diving forever, choosing to work only on small, shallow repair jobs. But sometimes, when I'm alone, sitting in my apartment, I feel a sudden, sharp, inexplicable pain in my chest, a cold, bruising ache exactly where the unseen force struck me in the tunnel. And when I listen to music, particularly songs with deep, low male voices, I can hear a faint, wavering chorus underlying the melody, the mournful song of the deep, a sound I know will stay with me until my own last breath. The pressure of the deep is gone, but the ghost of the weight remains. Story 9. I'm a mechanic by trade, but I inherited a legacy I never asked for, the Miller family farm in the heart of the Oklahoma Panhandle. My name is Clay, and when my grandfather died, he left me 100 acres of dry, dusty earth, a rusted-out tractor, and a farmhouse that looked ready to surrender to the wind. The place was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, and steeped in the quiet, desperate folk history of the prairie. I was there to sell it, but first I had to clean it out. The air inside the house smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something else, a dry, bitter scent like burnt leather that was pervasive and unnerving. The mystery began in the root cellar. It was a shallow, stone-lined space beneath the kitchen, cool and dark. Tucked behind a stack of rusted canning jars, I found a heavy, leather-bound book. It wasn't a Bible or a ledger. It was titled, in my grandfather's neat, spidery hand, The Farmer's Almanac of Fear. I opened it. It was not a calendar of planting seasons. It was a meticulously kept, generational record of a family's private, localized war with a single, malevolent entity bound to the Miller land. The first entry was dated 1904, written by my great-great-grandfather. It described the entity, a shadow, always seen in the periphery, always at the edge of the dust cloud. It was a creature of the earth, feeding on crops, livestock, and occasionally, the sheer will of the Miller men. It was never named, only referred to by the cryptic, capitalized designation, the famine. The journals described the family's defense, a system of rituals, specific plantings, and most bizarrely, a detailed list of sacrifices to placate the thing, small offerings of the firstborn calf, the first bushel of corn, or, ominously, a piece of clothing worn by a male member of the family. I sat there in the cellar, reading the meticulous records of 3 generations of terror. It wasn't folklore, it was a horrifying, day-to-day business log of spiritual survival. The first anomaly occurred that evening. I was in the kitchen, trying to cook a simple meal, my mind racing over the almanac's contents. I saw it, a fleeting shift in the light that passed the window, a movement too low to be a bird, too fast to be a man. It looked like a shadow moving against the light source, even though the sun had long set. I dismissed it, but then I heard a noise from the small, fenced-in paddock behind the barn. A sudden, terrifying scream from the lone, aging pony I had inherited with the farm. It was a shriek of pure, agonizing terror that was immediately cut short. I grabbed the flashlight and ran outside. The air was cold, dry, and absolutely still. The paddock fence was intact. The pony was standing in the middle of the enclosure, trembling violently, covered in a cold sweat. It was physically unharmed, but its eyes were wide with a terror that looked biblical. I checked the ground. There were no tracks, no sign of a break-in. But where the pony had been standing, the dry, cracked earth was covered in a circular patch of black, greasy fluid that smelled exactly like the burnt leather I had noticed in the house. I knew. The famine had been here. It had not taken the pony's life, but its calm. The next morning, I opened the almanac to the most recent entry, dated 6 months before my grandfather's death. It read, The thing grows bold. It took the well rope last night. It demands more than the first yield. The price is due. I looked at the ground. The old, long-disused well, covered by a stone lid, was 10 feet from the house. I lifted the lid. The old rope was gone. I knew I couldn't leave yet. I was compelled to finish the story. The Millers had held the line for a century. I had to understand the rules of the curse before I sold the land, because the curse was part of the property value. I decided to try the almanac's defense. That night, I followed the instructions for a minor placation, for a restless period. It required a specific herb, found in the almanac's illustrations, a bowl of spring water, and a piece of my own clothing, worn for 24 hours. I found the herb in the dried-out garden, used the water from a clean jug, and placed the offering on a flat stone 20 feet from the back door. I used a gray t-shirt I'd been wearing all day. I locked myself inside and watched. At 3 o'clock, the temperature in the house dropped 15 degrees. I heard the dry, rasping sound of the wind, even though the air outside was perfectly still. I looked out the window. The Almanac of Fear was open on the table, and I read the section on minor placation again. A crucial line I had missed jumped out at me. The sacrifice must be untouched by iron and witnessed by none. My t-shirt had a zipper. My eyes were witnessing. I had broken the rules. I watched the offering stone in terror. A figure began to form near the stone. It wasn't a shadow. It was a three-dimensional absence. A distortion of the light, shaped like a tall, sinewy human, but defined by the way the surrounding stars and the porch light seemed to bend around it. It slowly approached the stone. It didn't kneel. It simply extended a long, dry, three-fingered hand toward the t-shirt. I was paralyzed. I was a witness. The entity didn't touch the shirt. It moved past the garment, and instead picked up the bowl of spring water. It lifted the bowl and tipped it. The water did not pour out. It seemed to be inhaled by the shape, disappearing into the void it represented. Then, the shape looked up. It wasn't a face, but I felt the weight of its attention, a cold, geological focus that spanned generations. The entity raised its hand, and pointed, not at me, but at the almanac on my kitchen table. It was telling me to read the penalty. The shape dissipated, and the air warmed instantly. The terror was gone, replaced by a deep, shivering exhaustion. I opened the almanac to the next blank page. A new entry, written in my grandfather's distinct hand, appeared in front of my eyes, the ink still wet and smelling of the bitter burnt leather. The price for the witness is not the life, but the voice. The next Miller man will be silenced by the earth's hunger. The message was clear. The punishment for my mistake was the loss of my ability to speak, to communicate, to warn the next generation. It was a generational curse designed to perpetuate itself. I spent the next 48 hours in a silent, methodical panic. I didn't speak. I tested my voice, but only a dry, rattling whisper came out. I was losing my voice, the life force of my identity, to the famine. I had to end the cycle. I couldn't just leave. I packed the almanac, the pony, and my essential supplies. Before leaving, I returned to the well, the source of the famine's latest demand. I didn't bring a rope. I brought a 5-gallon can of gasoline and a box of long, sulfur matches. I stood over the well. I poured the gasoline directly into the shaft, the fluid hitting the hidden water deep below with a sickening, gurgling sound. I backed up 20 feet. I lit a single match. I threw the match into the well shaft. The resulting explosion was immediate and biblical. A massive, bellowing fireball erupted from the earth, shooting 20 feet into the night sky, throwing a column of black, greasy smoke into the clean prairie air. The roar was deafening, a sound of agony and power that shook the very foundations of the old house. The famine screamed, a sound that was not a voice, but a primal, earth-shaking howl of violation. I drove away under the light of the burning well. I didn't look back until the fire was a tiny, flickering point on the horizon. I had not killed the entity. I had violated its home, making the land worthless to it. I settled in a small town in Kansas, working on engines, a quiet, methodical life. My voice returned 2 weeks later, hoarse and thin, but present. I still have the almanac. It sits in a steel safe, unopened. But sometimes, when I'm working under a car, wrench in hand, I hear the sound of the dry Oklahoma wind. And I feel a presence, not hostile, but hungry. I look at my hands, and I see the dust of the prairie clinging to my knuckles. And I know the famine is still out there, its territory ruined, but its hunger redirected. It can't have my voice, but it can have my silence. And every night, I make sure the lights are on. The engine is running, and that I've never forgotten to offer the taxidermy owl a piece of my worn clothing, just in case. Story 10. They call this place Suncrest Meadows, a development of 93 perfectly identical townhomes outside Tampa, Florida. It's the definition of planned perfection, a monument to affordable modernity. My name is Kevin Shaw, and 2 months ago, I closed on Unit 42C. I'm a man who values order, symmetry, and a lack of surprises. This was my sanctuary. The aesthetic was controlled by the Homeowners Association, the HOA, a silent, powerful governing body that ensured the entire community remained perpetually pristine. No garbage cans visible after 6 a.m., no unapproved landscaping, and certainly no deviations from the approved paint palette. The silence here was manicured, a carefully cultivated backdrop to the hum of air conditioning units and the distant drone of I-75. It felt safe. It felt predictable. The first sign that something was violently wrong with my predictable, $250,000 sanctuary was the thermostat. It was a Nest system, smart, networked, and precise. I kept the temperature locked at 73 degrees Fahrenheit, 24/7. But on a Tuesday afternoon, as I was on a video conference in my home office, the digital display flashed wildly. It jumped from 73 to 95, then instantly down to 62, then back up to 88, cycling with a terrifying, rhythmic speed. The unit was clearly malfunctioning, struggling to maintain control. I could hear the AC condenser outside kicking on and off with a violent, shuddering clunk thump. I ended the call, reset the unit, and wrote it off as a simple tech glitch. The power surges in Florida are notorious. But the next day, the thermostat was fine. Instead, the disorder moved to the pictures. I have a small gallery wall in the main hallway, 5 framed prints hung in a precise, measured geometric arrangement. I am meticulous about alignment. When I walked past it after my morning coffee, the central print, a black and white photo of the Manhattan skyline, was hanging at a shallow, almost imperceptible 3-degree tilt. A ghost that aligns pictures. I laughed it off, straightening it with a quick flick of my wrist. But when I came back from the grocery store 2 hours later, it was tilted again. Same degree. I checked the wall hook, solid. I checked the wire, taut. I straightened it again, slowly, ensuring it was level with the spirit level from my toolbox. Later that evening, the picture was hanging at a 7-degree tilt. It was deliberate, a petty, persistent act of aesthetic vandalism. The entity was signaling its contempt for my order, and by extension, for the HOA's control. I woke up on day 5 to the smell of ozone and a new sound. It was the sound of something heavy, dragging across the concrete foundation directly beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. It was a slow, gravelly scrape, that felt more geological than mechanical. It sounded like something immense was shifting beneath the new, perfect foundation of Suncrest Meadows. I went down to the living room and found the source of the ozone. My brand new 75-inch smart television, mounted flush against the wall, had a dark, jagged crack running from the lower right corner up to the center. It wasn't the impact of a thrown object. It looked like the screen had been shattered from the inside out. The glass was bowed outward slightly at the epicenter of the fracture. I was instantly furious, the financial loss hitting me first. I walked up to the TV, reaching out a hand to touch the crack. The air around the television screamed. It was a sudden, high-pitched, electronic shriek of pure static that blasted from the shattered internal speakers of the set. The volume was impossible, physically painful, A white noise attack that hit me like a solid wall of sound. I stumbled backward, clutching my ears, my equilibrium gone. The sound lasted for 5 deafening seconds and then vanished, replaced by the humming silence of the apartment. This was no residual haunting. This was an entity of pure, localized energy and rage, a high-octane poltergeist built for the modern home. I called the police, citing a break-in and vandalism. They found no forced entry, no footprints, and no explanation for the sound. They suggested faulty electronics and high-frequency resonance. I filed an insurance claim, which was immediately flagged for suspicion. The HOA sent me a stiff, formal warning about the unauthorized noises disturbing the community peace. The contrast between the demonic activity inside and the banal bureaucracy outside was surreal. The entity's attacks now became physical and focused directly on my personal space, escalating into a terrifying, sustained siege. I moved my cot into the guest room, hoping to escape the malevolent focus of the master suite. It didn't work. That night, as I lay awake, heart pounding, I watched the bedside lamp, a heavy ceramic base, slowly, deliberately, begin to move across the polished wood surface of the nightstand. It didn't vibrate, it slid, as if pulled by an invisible string. It continued until it reached the edge, where it simply levitated for 3 seconds, hanging suspended in the air, casting a single, flickering shadow on the ceiling. Then, it was thrown, not dropped, but hurled with phenomenal force across the room, smashing into the opposite wall with an explosive crunch. I leaped out of bed, grabbing the tactical flashlight I now kept under my pillow. I dictated a log into my voice recorder, my voice a shaky, desperate whisper. 1:42 a.m. Full spectrum, high-energy poltergeist activity confirmed. Object levitation and violent propulsion observed. Entity demonstrates control over mass and inertia. This is a targeted attack. I am under siege. The entity didn't stop. It began to orchestrate a terrifying symphony of destruction. I retreated to the living room, standing in the center of the open-plan space, my only strategy now being to observe the chaos. The upper kitchen cabinets, white and smooth, suddenly burst open, every door flying wide at the same time. The crockery inside, plates, bowls, glasses, didn't fall. They were fired horizontally across the room, shattering against the walls with the impact of small projectiles. The kitchen looked like a war zone, smeared with flour, crushed food, and jagged shards of ceramic. The entity was demonstrating its sheer, chaotic power. Then, it turned its focus on me. I felt a sudden, sharp, inexplicable pain in my chest, a physical punch from an unseen fist. I gasped, stumbling back against the wall. The pain was immediate, like a cracked rib, forcing the air from my lungs. As I struggled to breathe, a section of the pristine drywall directly above my head cracked with a loud, tearing sound. A large, jagged piece of the sheetrock, about 3 feet by 3 feet, ripped away from the wall and plummeted toward me. I ducked just in time. The heavy plaster hit the floor where I had been standing, kicking up a cloud of white dust. Imprinted on the back of the ripped drywall, facing the space it had torn from, was a grotesque, dark brown smear. It wasn't paint or dirt. It was a slick, wet residue that smelled strongly of burnt leather, mixed with the acrid scent of ozone. It looked like a single, massive palm print, a 5-fingered signature of the immense, foundational power that had just tried to crush me. The entity had used the very structure of my new home as a weapon. I knew I was dealing with something not merely ghostly, but demonic, a force that inhabited the earth beneath the foundation and was actively resisting the clean, modern life built over it. The hellmouth was not a metaphor. It was literally under the HOA's manicured grass. I ran. I didn't stop for keys or wallet or documentation. I smashed my way through the sliding glass door leading to the small backyard patio, running barefoot through the shattered glass, through the perfectly manicured lawn, and out onto the sidewalk. I ran until I reached the main gate of Suncrest Meadows, where the plastic banner still proudly proclaimed, "Welcome home." I collapsed on the curb, gasping, looking back at the dark, silent profile of Unit 42C. I never returned. The insurance company denied my claim, citing intentional damage and failure to cooperate. The HOA sent me an invoice for the destroyed sliding glass door and the exterior paint damage, threatening legal action. I live in a studio apartment now, across town. I pay my rent in cash. And I avoid technology that can be remotely accessed. The entity won. It destroyed my order, my sanctuary, and my sanity. But the most terrifying knowledge is this. I drove past Suncrest Meadows 6 weeks later. The shattered glass had been cleaned up. The hole in the drywall had been patched. The exterior had been repainted. Unit 42C looked perfect again. A U-Haul truck was parked in the driveway. A young couple, laughing, were carrying a brightly colored sectional sofa into the front door. They had clearly just closed on the house. And as I drove past, I looked at the perfectly manicured lawn, and I saw a single, small, bright red gardening gnome, a clear, flagrant violation of the strict HOA exterior rules, sitting on the pristine grass, its plaster eyes fixed on the house. I knew the tenant of the foundation was back to work, starting its campaign of terror anew, using the new tenants to set the stage for the next, inevitable, and violent destruction of perfect, modern life. The chaos beneath the perfection is relentless. Story 11. The terms of the inheritance were baffling. My great-uncle Silas had left me his entire estate, provided I live on the property for at least a year. If I left before the term was up, the land, the house, and all its contents would revert to the perpetual trust of the woods, a legal entity I couldn't trace. My name is Julian Hayes. I'm a corporate attorney from Boston, and I understand contracts, not rural occultism. But Silas's remote property, nestled deep in the Maine wilderness near the Canadian border, was worth millions in untapped timber, so I packed my bags and traded the concrete jungle for the actual woods. The house sat on a small, elevated plateau, surrounded by a dense, dark forest of spruce and hemlock that looked less like a natural boundary and more like a physical wall. It was a classic New England farmhouse, heavy on dark wood and low on light, giving off the pervasive smell of wood smoke, mildew, and wet earth. The isolation was profound. The nearest paved road was 5 miles of mud and gravel away. The atmosphere was immediately wrong. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of the country. It was a stifling, heavy stillness, as if the very air was too thick to carry sound. I began my inspection, the initial, pragmatic phase of my forced residency. That's when I discovered the codes. Silas had been a methodical man. Every doorframe, every window ledge, and even the mantelpiece in the living room was scored with small, intricate carvings. They weren't decorative. They were small, repetitive symbols, circles with intersecting lines, runes I didn't recognize, and a recurring motif that looked like a bird's claw gripping a circle. They were faint, almost faded by time, but deliberate. The house was covered in a network of protective, ritualistic glyphs, a visual perimeter against something outside. I documented everything, initially assuming it was the eccentricity of an old man, a defense against the mundane world. The first hint of what the codes were defending against came from the woods. It was my 4th night. I was trying to sleep in the huge, cold master bedroom when I heard a sound from the exterior. A loud, wet thump, like a large, heavy sack of meat hitting the dirt, just outside the house. It was immediately followed by a low, drawn-out groaning, a sound too resonant to be human, too pained to be a deer. I grabbed the flashlight and forced myself to look out the window. My beam cut through the thick fog that always blanketed the ground level. I saw nothing. But where the sound had come from, the fog seemed to be churning, swirling rapidly into a dark vortex, then settling back into a flat, impenetrable white blanket. The next morning, I checked the spot. The mud was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of impact. But the faint, metallic, acrid smell I had noticed upon arrival was overwhelmingly strong here, like stale blood and burning leaves. I began to realize that the house was not just in the woods. It was within a territory, and the occupant was checking its boundaries. I went back to the house and looked at the codes on the doorframe. I suddenly noticed that a carving near the kitchen entrance, the bird's claw, had been scratched over, deliberately ruined, as if by a sharp, thin object. The protective shield had been breached. I started researching regional folklore. I drove an hour to the nearest tiny, dusty library and searched for Maine woods cryptids, old colonial pacts, and blood trusts. I found only fragmented, terrifying snippets, tales of the warden of the pines, an ancient spirit of the deep woods that demanded more than simple tribute, it demanded fidelity to the land. The warden was not a demon, it was a hungry, jealous landlord. The entity's presence became a subtle, invasive siege designed to establish its ownership over me. I found myself feeling an irrational, desperate attachment to the house. I would stand in the living room and feel a powerful, seductive calm, a voice in my mind whispering, "You are home. You do not need the city. This is your truth. Stay." I started forgetting my friends' names, the details of my old job, the urgency of the outside world. The isolation was pulling me under, severing the emotional cords to my past. The attacks on the physical perimeter continued, but they were now acts of slow, methodical subversion. The small, square patch of lawn I had painstakingly mowed around the house began to turn black. Not dead, but physically stained by something growing from the soil. It was a rapid, fungal growth of black, slimy moss that spread in an unnaturally perfect circle, encroaching on the house perimeter. It looked like the forest floor was sending out a creeping, dark vanguard. I tried to kill it with chemical weed killer. The moss died instantly, but within an hour, a powerful, sweet, cloying floral scent, the scent of decaying lilies, began to pour into the house through the basement vents, so thick it felt like I was choking on perfume. The warden was reacting to my aggression, fighting me with sensory overload. The final, terrifying escalation came when the warden began to use the codes against me. I was in the attic, searching through old boxes. I found my uncle's final journal. The last entry was brief and despairing. "It knows the key. It needs the blood on the code. I have lost the pact. Run." I ran down to the first floor. I checked the main front door, the most heavily coded entrance. The carvings were clear, but one of the recurring symbols, the circle, was smeared with a thick, wet, dark substance that looked like old motor oil. And resting directly on the mantelpiece, where the main protective code was carved, was an old, tarnished key. It was the key to the main door. I hadn't seen it there before. I was certain. The moment my eyes registered the key, the door behind me slammed shut with an ear-splitting crack that shook the house. I heard the lock mechanism click with a heavy, final sound. The key was locked in with me. The silence that followed was total. The warden had finally locked me in, using the ritualistic defenses of the house to create a spiritual trap. I tried to open the door, pounding on the heavy wood. Locked solid. I was trapped in a house whose very walls were now a prison. Then, from the darkness of the hall, I heard the sound I dreaded most, a low, resonant thump. It came from directly outside the front door. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Thump. It was the warden, and it was waiting. I ran to the drawing room window, frantically scanning the glass for a way out. I found more codes there, and they were all active. But then, I saw the key on the mantelpiece again, and I understood the final, horrifying clause of the pact. The warden didn't want to kill me, it wanted to incorporate me. I grabbed the heavy key and, in a fit of panic, ran back to the front door. I put the key in the lock, turning it with a frantic, desperate click. The door opened. I didn't stop to think. I didn't grab my belongings. I ran out of the house and onto the plateau, past the churning fog and the black, fungal moss. As I ran down the dirt track, I looked back one last time. Standing in the open doorway, silhouetted against the dark interior of the house, was a tall, thin figure draped in shadow, its outline indistinct. It didn't chase me. It simply stood there, watching me run. And as I hit the forest line, I heard a final sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, dry chuckle that felt less like sound and more like a thought in my own head. I made it back to Boston. I forfeited the land, the house, and the entire estate to the perpetual trust of the woods. I never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm in my sterile, modern apartment, I wake up in the middle of the night and find myself carving small, intricate, interlocking symbols into the wooden frame of my bed. I do it unconsciously, methodically, a desperate, final defense against the silence that I know is waiting for me. I can never truly leave the code behind. I am Silas's legacy, and the Warden of the Pines is still waiting for me to fulfill the terms of the lease. Story 12. My name is Leo Vance, and for 10 months my life was ruled by the rhythm of an empty office building. The structure was a colossal, 40-story stone monolith in downtown Chicago, a relic of 1920s architecture, now mostly vacant and waiting for a full remodel. I was the night concierge, a glorified security guard running solo from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The money was good, the isolation profound, and my job was simple: monitor the CCTV, log the temperature, and ensure the eternal silence of the place remained unbroken. The silence was the first thing that got to you. 40 floors of deserted offices, sound dampened by a century of corporate secrets and thick carpeting. You could hear the distant, continuous thrum of the city through the massive plate glass windows, but inside, every footstep, every cough, every rustle of my uniform was amplified into a sonic event. My desk was in the cavernous, marble-lined lobby, and I was, for 8 hours, the last man on earth. The building had a famous, local urban legend: the quiet floor. The architects had originally planned it as a 13-story structure, but due to fire codes and a pervasive sense of superstition, the floor between 12 and 14 was sealed off, never finished, and never officially rented. I'd asked the maintenance chief, an old-timer named Frank, about it. Frank just gave me a long look over his coffee mug. "It exists, Leo. But not for us. The 13th floor is where the noise goes to die." I checked the schematics. Sure enough, the vertical shaft between 12 and 14 was longer than the others. There was a space there, a sealed, undefined volume of darkness. The quiet started to break around the 3-month mark. It began, predictably, with the elevator. I was looking at the security feed, watching the blinking green lights of the elevator cars in their shaft. At 2:17 a.m., Car 3, the express elevator, began a solitary, unscheduled journey. It went up from the ground floor, past the 5th, the 7th, the 12th, and then, its light stopped. It paused for exactly 35 seconds before continuing to the 14th floor. I checked the logs. No maintenance scheduled. No access codes used. The car simply stopped in the interstitial space, the 13th floor, then continued. I dismissed it as a mechanical error, a glitch in the aged wiring. But it happened again the next night. And the night after that. Always Car 3. Always between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Always a stop of 30 to 40 seconds on the non-existent floor. I started watching the feed obsessively. I tried to focus the camera on the elevator cab itself, but the interior cameras were low resolution, showing only the back wall of the car, which was empty. The sound feed, however, picked up something faint. During the 35 seconds the car stopped on the 13th floor, the microphone registered a quick, subtle burst of static, immediately followed by a low, drawn-out sigh. It sounded deep, resonant, and profoundly tired. The elevator was stopping to pick up a passenger or perhaps to let one off. The next escalation was the sound anomaly. Around 4 a.m., deep into the most silent hours, I heard something that made me bolt upright in my chair. A heavy, clear, and unmistakable thud from somewhere high up. It was the sound of a large, dense object, a massive desk or a heavy filing cabinet, being dropped onto a wood floor. It was immediately followed by a sound of furniture being dragged, a grating scrape against stone, the noise echoing down the empty shaft of the building. I checked the internal acoustic sensors. Nothing on floors 14, 15, or 16. The sound had to be coming from the 13th floor, an area that was supposedly bare concrete and steel, a dead space that should have registered zero acoustics. The sound traveled down the ventilation shafts, bypassing the floor-by-floor sensors. I grabbed my patrol flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light, and took the service stairs. I was going to the 12th floor. The climb was exhausting, but the physical exertion helped quell the pure, mental panic. I reached the landing on the 12th floor, a pristine, white-walled hallway of a law firm. It was cold, silent, and entirely normal. I walked to the steel emergency door that marked the boundary to the stairwell leading up. I unlocked it and took the next flight up. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air was not only colder, it was thick with a dusty, metallic smell, an aroma like old paper and dried ink. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. I stopped at the 13th floor door. It was a massive, riveted steel barrier, not painted white like the others, but left in its original, dark gray, industrial finish. There was no number plate. I had to squint to see the faint, hand-painted number, 13, scratched onto the steel, almost deliberately erased. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The sound was immediately clear, a steady, rhythmic clack-clack-clack, the unmistakable sound of a heavy, archaic typewriter being used at high speed, punctuated by the sharp ping of the carriage return. The typing was relentless, frantic, and entirely out of place in the 21st century. I had a universal master key, but the slot for the 13th floor access had been permanently sealed with a black, hardened putty. This wasn't a fire door, it was a vault. I went back down to the 12th floor, found the fire escape door, and tried to find an access point. I realized the only way up was through car 3. I went back to the lobby, hard hammering, and waited for 2:17 a.m. When the time came, I was in car 3. The doors closed, and the lift began its ascent. I held the service override key in my hand, ready. As the car passed the 12th floor, the lights in the cab flickered violently. The car slowed, paused, and the ding of the elevator stopping resonated in the small space. I felt a slight, sickening lurch, a vertical shift that indicated the door mechanism was engaging. I was on the 13th floor. The doors hissed open. It wasn't a dark, unfinished construction zone. It was a perfectly functional, massive office space, but trapped in a time capsule. Desks were neatly arranged, covered in massive, boxy computers from the 1980s. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and the entire floor was covered in a thick, pervasive layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in 40 years. Yet, it was undeniably used. The dust on the carpet was disturbed by fresh tracks, deep indentations leading down the main hallway toward the back offices. And the typing, the clack-clack-ping, was now loud, rapid, and very close. The air was heavy, dry, and cold. I drew my mag light and started walking. The horror was not the decay, it was the persistence of the work. I walked down the main corridor. Every desk was covered in stacks of yellowed, brittle paper. As I passed one desk, I noticed the massive computer monitor on it was displaying a single, static message in green phosphor: logging, unscheduled visitors. I stopped at the end of the hall, where a single, old-fashioned office door was slightly ajar, casting a narrow sliver of yellow-orange light onto the dark carpet. The typing was coming from within. I approached the door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had to see it. I forced myself to raise the camera on my belt, aiming the lens toward the gap. I shoved the door open with a brutal shove. The office was small, dominated by a heavy oak desk. Sitting behind it was a figure, tall, skeletal, wearing a severe, dark gray three-piece suit that was stiff with age. It was completely focused on a giant, black, manual typewriter, its fingers flying across the keys with impossible speed. The air around the figure was slightly shimmering, like a localized heat haze. As I watched, stunned, the figure stopped typing and slowly, deliberately, turned its head. It had no face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a pale, smooth expanse of skin, stretched tightly over a sharp skull. It was not a mask, it was an absence. It was the ultimate bureaucrat, a ghost performing endless, pointless paperwork. The figure slowly raised its hands from the keys, revealing that its fingers were stained black with ink, a greasy, dry residue. It was a horror of monotonous labor. And then, a new sound cut through the silence. A soft, clear, wet sound, the sound of a single sheet of paper being slowly carefully ripped from the typewriter carriage. The figure extended a long, ink-stained hand toward me, holding the paper. I knew, with the certainty of pure terror, that the paper contained my name, my details, and the full log of my unscheduled visit. My entire life had just been entered into the file of the quiet floor. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, scrambling back down the hall, the sound of the typewriter starting again, now faster, more frantic, documenting my retreat. I threw myself into the elevator, slamming the G button repeatedly. The doors refused to close. They stayed open, offering the view of the empty, dusty hallway, and the frantic clack-clack-ping of the endless, spectral work. I slammed the emergency stop, then hit G again. Finally, with a painful thunk, the doors closed, and the elevator plunged downward. I quit the next morning, leaving my keys and my resignation letter in a sealed envelope on the marble lobby desk. I now work a public, outdoor job, surrounded by sunlight and noise, a complete opposite to the silent tower. But sometimes, when I'm filing a simple form or signing a receipt, I feel a sudden, involuntary spasm in my hand, a quick, repetitive flick of my index finger. And for a moment, I feel the dry, cold sensation of ink-stained fingers against my own skin. I know the tenant of the quiet floor got his documentation. And I know that somewhere, in the sealed silence, he is still typing the details of my eternal debt to the building. Story 13. We called it the Echo Project. It was the culmination of 3 years of esoteric research into residual haunting, the theory that a specific, controlled environment could force a spiritual echo to manifest audibly. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne, a parapsychologist with a penchant for the extremely unconventional. My team consisted of 3 people: myself, a sound engineer named Chet, and a psychological monitor, Sarah. Our location: the abandoned remains of the St. Jude's Asylum, an early 20th century complex outside Pittsburgh, notorious for its electroshock and patient neglect. Our setup was not about cameras and EMF readers. It was about sensory deprivation and directed frequency. We established our command center in the old records room, surrounded by banks of sound monitoring equipment, infrasound generators, and environmental stabilizers. The actual experiment took place in the main hydrotherapy room, a subterranean chamber of cracked tile and water-stained concrete, chosen for its unique acoustic signature. We placed the subject, a non-responsive, custom-built mannequin wired with sensors, in the center of the room. We then sealed the room, cut the light, and began the sequence. The objective was to bombard the room with ultra-low, non-audible infrasound frequencies, the kind that induce feelings of fear, anxiety, and dread in the human brain. Our hypothesis: the intense, pervasive emotional frequency would interact with the ambient, sorrowful energy of the asylum, forcing an audible, intelligent response, the echo. We initiated the sequence on a cold, silent Tuesday night. The initial results were promising. Within 30 minutes of the infrasound going live, the acoustic monitors in the hydrotherapy room began to register minute, consistent fluctuations. Not static, but a pattern shift in the sound profile that suggested a foreign acoustic signature was attempting to form within the room. Then, the psychological monitoring began. Sarah, watching the data, spoke into the microphone, her voice crisp and professional. Elias, heart rate variability on the mannequin's proximity sensors is spiking. It's registering stress, possible localized thermal drop. Log it, I instructed, my voice calm. We are generating an emotional environment. It is responding. As the frequencies ramped up, the room's air pressure began to drop, registered by a barometric sensor placed on the mannequin. And then, we heard the first clear echo. It was a low, resonant humming, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to have no defined source. It was being generated by the air itself. It wasn't the sound of sorrow or fear. It was a sound of immense, geological impatience. Chet, the sound engineer, pointed frantically at his spectral analyzer. Elias, look at the signature. It's not a residual loop. It's reactive. The signature is shifting based on our input frequency. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline. We hadn't caught an echo. We had initiated a dialogue. I ordered a shift in frequency, injecting a calming, neutral wave into the infrasound sequence. The humming stopped. Total silence. Then, from the hydrotherapy room, a sound cut through the silence that made my blood run cold, the distinct, wet, rapid crying of an adult man, sobbing uncontrollably. The sound was so raw, so filled with agony, that it felt like an intrusion into our private space. "It's working," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's mirroring the fear. It's an emotional reaction, not a cognitive one. It is responding to the stimulus." I corrected, a detached scientist fighting a rising, primal terror. I ordered the frequency to be shifted again, back to the anxiety-inducing wave. The crying stopped. The humming returned, now louder, more powerful, and tinged with a distinct quality of anger. We were controlling the entity's emotional state, forcing it to react to our input. But in the process, we were revealing a terrifying, cognitive intelligence. The situation escalated violently in the next hour. The entity, which I now mentally refer to as the subject, began to mimic our own emotional states, feeding back our anxiety at a greater intensity. The air in the records room, our control center, began to feel heavy, suffocating. Chet, the calm, pragmatic engineer, suddenly snapped. He stood up, knocking his chair over, his eyes wide and panicked. "I can't breathe," he rasped, clutching his chest. I feel betrayed. Someone here is lying to me." He fixed his eyes on Sarah, accusing her of a betrayal that made no sense. He was experiencing a powerful, non-sequitur emotional breakdown. The subject was not just an echo, it was a psychological contagion, infecting us with amplified emotional terror. I had to physically restrain Chet, forcing him to take a sedative. Then, the Echo project went from an experiment to a spiritual attack. The subject stopped reacting to our frequency inputs. It had learned our controls. Instead, the acoustic monitors in the hydrotherapy room began to register a continuous, deafening roar of white noise. But underlying the static, a new, clear sound began to emerge, a sound that was a pure violation, my own voice speaking. But it was not saying my name or my thoughts. It was speaking a low, rhythmic, continuous litany of my greatest personal fears and failures. The memory of my father's disapproval, the guilt over a past relationship, the constant, gnawing anxiety over the project's funding, all voiced in my own tone, my own cadence, but filled with a profound, demonic contempt. The subject had used the low frequencies to map my subconscious. It had found the raw material of my own mind and was using it as a weapon. Sarah collapsed, covering her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Elias, shut it down! It's in our heads. It's not an echo, it's a demon!" I was the only one left standing, locked in a room with the auditory manifestation of my own existential terror. I struggled to focus on the control board, my fingers fumbling with the keys. The voice from the hydrotherapy room, my voice, grew louder, more mocking. The white noise surged, causing the lights in the records room to flicker violently. I finally managed to hit the main emergency shutdown sequence, killing the infrasound generators. Silence. Immediate. Total. Profound. I stood there, gasping, waiting for the echo to dissipate, waiting for the peace. But the silence was shattered by a new sound, coming from directly behind me, from the closed door of the records room. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic snoring. A heavy, wet, guttural sound, exactly like my own father's breathing as he slept. The subject had not dissipated. It had simply left the hydrotherapy room and was now resting just outside my door, a final, mocking imposition of my personal anxiety. We fled the asylum within the hour, leaving all the equipment behind. Chet was hospitalized for a week with an anxiety-induced psychosis. Sarah resigned and moved out of state. I tried to salvage the data, but the hard drives were corrupted, filled only with 10 hours of white noise and the faint, low, aggressive humming. I shut down the Echo project and returned to teaching, focusing only on the historical aspects of parapsychology. I never touched a sensor again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I can't fall asleep. I lie there, wide awake, and I hear it, a faint, low, resonant snore, coming not from the walls or the ceiling, but from a space just outside my window, a dry, satisfied, guttural sound of a consciousness that has found its permanent resting place in the architecture of my own unrelenting fear. Story 14. They tell you that once you become a motorman on the New York subway, you start seeing the city as a network of scars, dark, forgotten tunnels, abandoned platforms, and the constant, thrumming presence of history that was never supposed to be seen. My name is Marco, and for 10 years, I drove the night shift on the D line. But my horror began on the F train, on the abandoned express line under Brooklyn, the one we only use for deadhead runs and reroutes. It was 3:30 a.m., deep into the graveyard shift. The train was completely empty, running the express line to the Coney Island yard. I was the only person on board, in the absolute isolation of the dark, cavernous tunnel, listening only to the metallic shriek of the wheels and the low, continuous roar of the third rail. The first sighting was a flash, a total non-event that my mind should have instantly dismissed. As my train pulled through the abandoned platform of the old Myrtle Avenue station, a place sealed off since the 1940s, I caught a quick glimpse through the connecting door into the first passenger car. A figure. It was a silhouette, pale and indistinct, sitting bolt upright on one of the empty, plastic bench seats. It was too fast to be real, too white to be a reflection. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by the dark, empty windows of the silent car. I told myself it was carbon monoxide fumes, a trick of the speed, or the visual fatigue of staring at a wall of darkness. The tunnels play games with your eyes. But the next night, on the same deadhead run, the sighting was longer, more deliberate. As I passed the old, disused platform, I looked into the connecting window. This time, there were 3 of them. 3 pale, silent figures sitting neatly in the seats, wearing what looked like heavy, outdated winter coats. They were not transparent, they were fully formed, but rendered in a kind of sickly, luminous white, like old bone. And they were all staring directly at the window where I sat. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowed the train slightly, fighting the irrational urge to slam on the brakes. I looked back, and as the train pulled clear of the tunnel lights, the figures vanished into the dark, leaving the car once again cold and empty. I started digging. I went into the Metropolitan Transit Authority archives and looked up the history of the express line. I found a single, chilling accident report from 1957. A catastrophic derailment and fire near the Myrtle Avenue station, a section of track that was notorious for its structural instability. The report listed 23 fatalities. I realized what I was seeing. The empty cars of my night run were being occupied by the mass ghost encounter, the spectral echo of the dead passengers, still making their final, disastrous journey. The entity was not a single demon. It was a collective trauma, a silent, perpetual crowd of the lost. I tried to avoid the line, but my schedule was set. The third run was the worst. I was driving the train when the first anomaly occurred inside my cab. The low, constant roar of the tunnel was suddenly broken by a brief, but incredibly clear, sound, a faint, metallic clink, the sound of a single nickel dropping onto a concrete floor. It was so close it felt like it came from my own lap. I checked the connecting window. The sight that greeted me made me physically recoil. The first car was now packed. Every seat was occupied by the pale, silent figures. They were jammed together, standing in the aisles, clinging to the poles, a full complement of the 23 souls who had died in the wreck. They were rendered in a chilling, uniform luminescence, their faces indistinct, their bodies heavy and still. And they were all, without exception, looking at me. The most terrifying thing was that they were not threatening. They were impatient. They looked like commuters who had been waiting for their train for 60 years, and now that it had arrived, they were waiting for the next step. I pushed the throttle forward, speeding up, trying to outrun the occupants of my own train. As the speed increased, the figures began to move. They didn't stand up. They began to slide along the floor of the train car. their bodies moving forward in a slow, unnatural, liquid motion toward the connecting door that separated the cab from the first car. I could see their pale, expressionless faces filling the entire window, their silent, empty eyes fixed on me. They were converging, a collective, unstoppable mass, coming to take their driver. A new sound began to permeate the cab, a high-pitched, insistent ringing, the sound of an old, mechanical streetcar bell being rung rapidly, violently, right outside my door. It was the sound of an ancient, urgent warning, a demand to stop. My professional training snapped. I slammed the emergency brake, bringing the entire train to a grinding, shuddering halt deep in the black tunnel between stations. Silence returned, absolute and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of the air brakes. I looked at the connecting door window. The crowd was gone. The entire car was empty again, the seats pristine and untouched. The silence was back. I sat there, shaking, until the dispatcher called, demanding my location. I had to stop. I mumbled into the radio. Unscheduled stop. Obstruction on the track. I drove the rest of the run at a crawl, checking the mirrors, checking the windows. The cars remained empty. But as I pulled into the yard, and the ambient noise of the city returned, I looked at the side of my train. The metal plating on the very front car, where the ghost crowd had pressed against the door, was covered in a thick, metallic dust. I ran my hand over it. It was fine, chalky, and smelled faintly of copper and iron. It was the literal residue of the 23 ghosts, the fine metal dust they had left behind. I quit the subway the next day. I can't look at a crowded room without seeing the pale, still faces of the commuters. But the horror did not end in the tunnel. It followed me above ground, into my small, crowded apartment in Queens. I was riding a simple, crowded bus downtown, standing in the aisle, clinging to a pole. I looked at the fare box. It was the same design as the ancient, mechanical fare boxes they used on the old streetcars. And I felt a sudden, powerful, invisible push on my lower back, forcing me to stumble forward. As I caught myself, I heard the faint, metallic clink of a single coin hitting the glass of the fare box. I looked around the crowded bus. Everyone was minding their own business. But I knew. The ghost passenger had purchased a ticket and was now riding with me, waiting for the day I stopped the bus and opened the doors for the final, eternal commute. I look at my fellow passengers now, and I see them not as people, but as temporary, warm replacements for the cold, empty shells waiting in the dark below. Story 15. The antique desk was a mahogany beast, heavy, dark, and intricately carved with swirling, Baroque designs. I bought it on a whim at a chaotic New Orleans estate auction, drawn by its weight and its sense of imposing history. My name is Arthur Vance, and I'm a writer struggling with a perpetually overdue manuscript. I installed the desk in my humid, atmospheric apartment, hoping its history would inspire me. It brought more than inspiration. It brought a very specific kind of financial possession. The desk's true weight became apparent immediately. It wasn't just physical. As soon as I sat down to work, I was hit by an overwhelming, crippling wave of financial anxiety that was entirely foreign to me. I wasn't wealthy, but I was stable. Yet, suddenly, I felt the terror of imminent bankruptcy, the cold, gnawing fear of debt collectors, and the profound guilt of being a financial failure. The desk was an emotional anchor to a dark, monetary past. I found the desk's history in a brittle, yellowed manifest tucked deep inside a hidden compartment. It belonged to a man named Silas Thorne, a prolific, ruthless 19th century accountant and private creditor, a loan shark, who had died unexpectedly at that very desk in 1898. The desk was his life, the source of his wealth and the tomb of his final, unpaid accounts. Silas was not a classic ghost. He was a haunting of finance. The first audible anomaly began within a week. I'd be working late, the gaslight casting long, dancing shadows, when I'd hear it, a rapid, rhythmic clack-clack-clack coming from the desk itself. It was the distinct sound of an old, heavy-set typewriter being used at high speed, immediately followed by the sharp ding of the carriage return. The sound was not loud, but insistent, always seeming to come from the deepest part of the wood. I jump up, inspect the desk, but find nothing. The sound would stop the instant I stood up, only to resume as soon as I sat back down. Silas was still working, and I was now his reluctant apprentice. The influence began to extend into my waking life, manifesting as obsessive, compulsive financial behavior that was entirely contrary to my nature. I started leaving the house every afternoon to visit the dusty, quiet archives of the local bank, spending hours meticulously researching my own grandfather's long-settled estate, digging through transactions from the 1950s. I felt a desperate, driving need to audit my entire family's financial history, looking for phantom debts, overpaid taxes, and historical errors. I would find small, long-forgotten accounts and feel an immediate, aggressive urge to correct them. The emotion was not my own. It was Silas's meticulous, unforgiving accountant's rage. My writing, once focused on historical fiction, became consumed by Silas's obsession. My manuscript devolved into a detailed, 300-page treatise on the history of predatory lending in the Reconstruction South. My prose became dry, precise, and filled with arcane financial terminology. The physical activity was subtle, always centered around the desk. I noticed a tiny, shallow scratch appear on the polished surface of the desktop. It was about an inch long, a faint line near the edge of the leather inlay. The next day, the scratch was longer, deeper, and accompanied by a small, perfectly round burn mark, as if a hot coin had been left resting there. The damage was not vandalism, it was wear and tear. Silas was using the desk, and the physical manifestation of his spectral work was appearing on the wood. Then came the letters. I started receiving mail that was not addressed to me. Small, sealed envelopes made of heavy, cream-colored paper, delivered through the mail slot, often late in the afternoon. The handwriting was a precise, old-fashioned copperplate script, and the envelopes were sealed with a dollop of ancient, dry red wax, stamped with a monogram that read, SD. I tore open the first one. It was a formal, chilling demand for payment. Not from me, but from a name I didn't recognize. Mr. Elias Hawthorne, New Orleans, $1,500 due 1897. It was a century-old debt, a final notice from Silas's archives. I was receiving the overdue bills of the dead. I burned the letter immediately, the dry paper flaring up in my fireplace. The moment the paper turned to ash, the sound of the typewriter in the desk resumed, now faster, more violent. The clack-clack-clack filled with an auditory fury. The sound continued for 20 full minutes, an audible, spiritual tantrum. I realized I couldn't destroy Silas's work. I could only enrage him. The debt had to be settled. I spent the next 3 days hunting for the lineage of Mr. Elias Hawthorne, finding a distant, impoverished descendant named Elijah Hawthorne living in a housing project in the city. I went to him, a bag of cash in hand. He was terrified, confused, and had no knowledge of any 1897 debt. I handed him the $1,500, a ridiculous sum adjusted for inflation, and simply said, "A historical correction. Consider the account settled." The moment the cash left my hands, I felt the internal pressure lift. The crippling anxiety of debt vanished, replaced by a momentary, profound satisfaction, a sense of final, brutal accounting. I returned to the apartment, exhausted. The typewriter was silent. The smell of burnt leather was gone. I had paid the ghost's debt, and the debt was my peace of mind. I thought it was over. But Silas was a shrewd accountant. That night, I woke up to a faint, rhythmic sound from the desk. Not typing, but a dry, rasping scratching. I turned on the light. Sitting on the desk blotter, centered on the leather inlay, was a single, tarnished copper penny, dated 1898. And next to it was a small, handwritten note, perfectly centered on the desk. The script was the same copperplate. Interest due. Daily. Silas hadn't left. He had converted the debt. I was no longer paying his old accounts. I was paying the interest on his continuous, eternal spiritual work, payable daily. I knew I couldn't live with this. I had to end the transaction. I went to the desk, and instead of trying to destroy it, I gave it what it craved most: finality. I took a heavy, antique ledger book, and on the front page, I wrote a single, bold line. The final account of Silas Thorne. All debts paid. Zero balance. Closed. I signed it, dated it, and left it on the blotter. I then pulled the heavy desk away from the wall, revealing the dry, cracked plaster. With a crowbar, I meticulously carved the same definitive, final declaration into the wall behind the desk. Closed. I sold the apartment the next week. I left the desk behind, with the signed ledger open on the blotter. I never write at a wooden desk anymore. I use a laptop on a standing, metal surface, minimizing my contact with anything that might anchor a possession. But sometimes, when I'm walking through a busy street, I feel a sudden, sharp, inexplicable urge to check my pockets. I put my hand in and pull it out, and the palm is covered in a fine, dry, metallic residue. I smell it. It's the faint, acrid scent of old copper and dried ink. I know Silas is still working, and he is occasionally docking my pay in the spiritual realm, a reminder that the price of the overdue bill is never truly settled. Story 16. I'm an ex-Forest Service ranger, spent 15 years of my life navigating the brutal, majestic chaos of the Montana Rockies. My name is Garrett Finch, and I know the rhythm of the high country. When a lone hiker, a geologist named Dr. Alan Cross, went missing deep in the isolated Flathead National Forest, I was one of the few people they called in for the search. Cross had been a meticulous man, and his last known campsite was located near a stretch of the Kootenai River known for its treacherous currents and its unnerving, incessant roar. I found his camp easily, precisely where he marked it on his map. The tent was still standing, the gear neatly organized. But inside his journal, I found the first terrifying clue: 3 pages of tight, frantic script detailing his growing obsession with the sound of the river. His final entry was a chilling spiral into madness. The water is not just noise. It is trying to tell me something. It is whispering names. It is calling me to the center, where the sound is the clearest. I have to go to the source. The river knows my name. The river, when I reached it, was not a peaceful stream. It was a churning, white-flecked torrent of glacial meltwater, moving with a terrifying speed and an overwhelming, continuous shroom of noise that drowned out all other sound. The river was a physical force, and its roar was the primary anomaly. I followed the bank upstream, looking for signs of a struggle. I didn't find them. Instead, I found a single, unnerving detail: a makeshift cairn of smooth, white river stones piled neatly on a small, dry embankment, placed there by a human hand. On top of the cairn, resting flat, was Dr. Cross's waterproof, handheld satellite phone. It was turned off, its battery removed. He had deliberately surrendered his contact with the world. I turned the phone back on. The screen was still displaying the last message he had typed, a complete text, never sent, addressed to his wife. The river has offered me the quiet. Don't come looking. You won't hear me. I knew then that I wasn't looking for a lost man. I was tracking a man who had been lured away by an intelligent, malevolent force bound to the water. The river was the entity, and its whisper was the weapon. I continued upstream, keeping the search meticulous, but my own sensory perception began to warp. The relentless roar of the water began to break down the natural silence, replacing it with something else. I began to hear voices within the shroom of the water. Not distinct words, but patterns of sound that my brain desperately tried to decode. It sounded like a crowd of people talking in a massive, enclosed space, their voices distorted by the liquid medium. The sound was always just on the edge of comprehension, an auditory tease. Then, the whisper became personal. I was standing on a large, flat boulder near a shallow curve in the river, the water rushing violently around me. And in the chorus of the roar, I heard a faint, single, clear word, spoken in a breathy, feminine whisper that cut through the noise. Garrett. It was my name. Perfectly clear. It was too close to be an echo. It felt like the whisper came from the air, inches from my ear, originating from the turbulent water directly below the boulder. I shouted into the wind, a loud, defiant roar of my own. "Show yourself!" The only response was the deep, mocking shrom of the water, which seemed to intensify in volume, as if laughing at my challenge. I dictated my findings into my recorder, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and professional resolve. 1430. Experiencing auditory hallucination. Possible onset of exhaustion or sensory overload. The entity is using the noise of the water to create cognitive contact. Its target is the mind. The river began to fight me with enticement. I was walking along the bank when I saw something incredibly out of place. A patch of green, impossibly vibrant grass growing on a tiny spit of dry land, sheltered from the torrent. It was lush, soft, and looked like a manicured lawn in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving wilderness. As I walked toward it, I felt a sudden, powerful urge to lie down in the grass. An overwhelming, seductive exhaustion washed over me, a feeling of absolute, final peace. The river seemed to soften its roar, its sound dropping to a gentle, welcoming lullaby. The voices became soft, comforting hums. Sleep. Rest. This is your final peace. I took 2 steps toward the green patch, my body yearning for the relief. Then, my foot kicked something hard on the gravel. It was a small, worn boot, a modern hiking boot, just like the kind Dr. Cross had been wearing. It was waterlogged, heavy, and severed cleanly at the ankle. The sight of the physical trauma shattered the hypnotic spell. The seductive peace vanished, replaced by a cold, immediate fear. The lush green grass was not an offer of rest, it was a gravestone. The river was not offering peace, it was offering dissolution. I grabbed the boot and threw it far into the woods, breaking the physical connection. The river instantly became angry. The roar intensified to a deafening sound. The water level, which I had marked on a rock, seemed to rise rapidly, climbing 2 inches in the space of a minute. The current began to violently lash at the banks, churning up black mud and debris, as if trying to claw me back. I realized the core horror. The river was using the voices of the lost to lure others to their own doom, a perpetual cycle of waterborne sacrifice. Then I heard a new voice, a frantic, male shout, distorted by the water, but undeniably clear. It was a voice I didn't recognize, screaming, "It's cold! So cold! Don't listen to the whisper!" It was Dr. Cross, fighting back in his final, waterlogged moments, his consciousness temporarily breaking free from the entity's thrall to offer a single, desperate warning. I took the warning. I knew I couldn't beat the river. I had to leave its territory. I turned and ran, scrambling up the steep embankment, away from the water. As I ran, I could hear the roar of the river fading, but the sound was now being replaced by a terrifying, high-pitched chorus of whispers that seemed to follow me up the hill, a crowd of voices shouting my name, telling me to come back, promising me eternal quiet. I ran until I hit the dry, silent pine forest, miles away from the water. I never found Dr. Cross's body. I resigned from the Forest Service. I now live in a dry, landlocked city in Nevada, far from any large body of water. But sometimes, when I'm in the shower, and the water is running, I feel the temperature suddenly drop to a near-freezing level. And when I close my eyes I hear it, a faint, low shrom of sound, followed by a familiar, feminine whisper. "Garrett, we are waiting. The water is so clear now." I know that the river remembers my name. And I know that one day, when I'm tired enough, I might accidentally listen to the whisper of the water and finally find the eternal quiet it offered. Story 17. The house was a typical 1960s split level in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac outside Atlanta. My name is Mike Denton, and I bought it as a fixer-upper, the perfect blend of potential and stability. The entire transaction was clean, the blueprints were standard, and the inspection was flawless. The only problem was the hidden room. 2 weeks into the renovation, as I was ripping out the old, dusty plaster in the main living room, my crowbar hit something hard that wasn't with studs. It was a secondary layer of wall, built from rough cinder blocks, completely masked by the modern drywall. I checked the blueprints again. There was no room there. The plans showed only an exterior wall. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. I worked for 3 hours, methodically chipping away at the plaster and brickwork, revealing a solid, seamless wall of aged stone. I finally broke through a section with a sledgehammer, creating an aperture large enough to crawl through. The air that poured out was cold, stale, and carried the heavy, acrid smell of old copper and decay. I crawled through the opening and shone my flashlight into the darkness. It was a small, perfectly square chamber, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, built directly into the concrete foundation, an internal box within the house's structure. It was completely empty, save for a thick layer of dust and a single, chilling detail, a massive, floor-to-ceiling cross that had been roughly carved into the far concrete wall, scored so deeply that the plastered dust was still visible around the edges. This was not storage. This was a prison. The moment I breached the wall, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air became heavy, thick, and palpably hostile. The entity that had been locked away in the hidden room was now free, and its rage was immediate and focused. The initial poltergeist activity was purely acoustic. I was trying to sleep in the master bedroom, the hole in the living room now covered by a temporary sheet of plywood. The house began to make sounds that were not the settling of wood. The sound started in the living room, a faint, dry, rhythmic scratching coming from the plywood, as if something with sharp claws was testing the barrier. Then, the sound would move. It would instantly stop at the plywood and start again on the ceiling directly above me, a rapid, frantic tapping, like bony fingers walking across the plaster. The entity was demonstrating its ability to move through the structure itself. I realized the horror of the hidden room. It wasn't a secret. It was a spiritual capacitor, and the structure of the house was now the conduit for the stored malice. The next day, the hidden room's inhabitants started manipulating the environment with a chilling focus on confinement. I was working in the garage, trying to cut lumber, when the heavy, rolling garage door suddenly, violently, slammed shut, the metallic thud shaking the entire house. I wasn't near the opener. I ran to the door, hit the button, and the door rolled up halfway, then stopped, and immediately slammed back down. Slam. 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 The mechanism was clearly overridden. I was locked in the garage. I ran to the side pedestrian door, but the old, rusted deadbolt, which I rarely used, had been driven shut with immense force. I could see the wood frame around the bolt slightly splintered inward. I was trapped in the garage, sealed in by a malicious, non-physical force. I had to use a heavy wrench to physically break the lock mechanism to get out. When I finally got back into the house, exhausted and shaking, I found the front door, which I had left ajar for ventilation, was now slammed shut and double-bolted. The house was sealing itself, trapping its new owner. The climax of the attack came that evening. I was sitting in the kitchen, exhausted, dictating my will into a recorder. I knew I couldn't stay, but I also knew I couldn't simply walk out. The house was actively fighting my exit. The sound of the scratching and tapping began again, but now it was everywhere, in the walls of the kitchen, the floor beneath my feet, the ceiling above my head. The house was roaring with an internal cacophony. Then, the lights went out. Total darkness. I grabbed my flashlight. The air became arctic, instantly dropping 30 degrees. I could see my own breath. I aimed the beam toward the living room, where the plywood barricade covered the hole to the hidden room. As I watched, a powerful, unseen force began to press on the plywood from the inside. The thin wood began to flex and groan inward, the screws popping out of the wall with loud ping sounds. The entity was trying to escape its prison and was succeeding. I heard a terrifying, wet thump against the inside of the plywood, immediately followed by the sound of heavy, rapid breathing coming from the same spot, a deep, raspy inhale-exhale that was unnervingly close. I backed up slowly, holding the light steady. I saw the final, terrifying visual. In the center of the flexing plywood, a single, perfect crack appeared, running vertically from top to bottom. And through that crack, a sliver of dark, wet liquid began to seep out, running down the face of the wood. It was thick, black, and smelled of the same old copper and decay. The entity was not just pushing the wood, it was bleeding through the wall. As I stood there, Frozen, I heard a faint, high-pitched screech from the floor directly behind me. I turned the light. My keys, which I had left on the kitchen counter, were now lying on the floor, perfectly centered on a growing patch of the same black, wet substance. The entity had moved my means of escape and marked it with its presence. I didn't try to retrieve them. I ran to the nearest window, kicked out the glass with the heel of my shoe, and threw myself out onto the lawn. I ran until I hit the street, and the soft, ambient yellow light of the suburban streetlights washed over me. I sat on the curb, gasping, looking back at the dark, silent house. I never went back. I signed the house over to the bank, citing an unforeseen structural issue, and walked away from the mortgage. I now live in a modern, single-story apartment, all open plan and glass. I have a profound phobia of confined spaces and solid walls. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear it, a faint, dry, rhythmic tapping coming from the back of my closet, a sound that is too fast, too deliberate to be a creak. And I know the entity from the forgotten room is still looking for the perfect structure to trap its next victim, patiently testing the thin walls of my quiet, modern life. Story 18. They said the old KTR-7 tower was shut down because of a transmitter fire, but everyone in the industry knew the real reason was the final broadcast. My name is Gary, and I'm an old-school broadcast engineer. I was hired by the holding company to dismantle the station. 30 years of dust, tubes, and cold, dead silence. A remote, squat concrete building perched on a windy hill in the California desert. The place was a museum of obsolete technology and a monument to bad energy. The station had gone dark during a live news hour in 1986. The news team, mid-sentence, was cut off by a blast of white noise, followed by a terrifying, silent 10-minute segment of something that was never officially explained. The lead anchor, a meticulous man named Walter, was later found dead in the studio, a massive, unprovoked cerebral hemorrhage the official cause. My job was to break down the consoles and scavenge the expensive copper wire. I had no choice but to work the night shift. The desert heat was unbearable during the day, and the generator was only stable after the sun went down. The moment I stepped into the main control room, the air was immediately charged with a static tension. The room was cavernous, dominated by banks of dark, silent equipment, and the smell of old vacuum tubes and ozone. I started my work methodically, labeling wires and documenting the setup. As I worked, I noticed something strange about the main mixing console, the massive, dust-covered central hub of the entire operation. It wasn't simply powered down. All the delicate, analog needles on the VU meters, the meters that measure audio volume, were pegged deep into the red zone, bent against their stops, as if they had been violently overloaded by a massive, unseen surge of sound. I ran a diagnostic on the main receiver. To my shock, the old analog tuner was still operational, running on its own dedicated power source. I flipped the dial, expecting only static. Instead, I found a signal. A live, clear broadcast. It was a sound so out of place it made my skin crawl, a precise, rhythmic, high-quality ticking sound, like a massive, old-fashioned clock, followed by a breathy, professional-sounding male voice counting down, one number every minute. 14. Pause. 13. Pause. 12. The sound was coming directly from the main studio monitor. I checked the frequency. It was broadcasting on a long-defunct, non-standard frequency, a ghost signal in the electromagnetic spectrum. I spent the next 2 hours documenting the anomaly. I realized the entity wasn't a ghost. It was a technological haunting, an echo of the final broadcast that was trapped in the hardware of the station. The terror began when the broadcast became a visual event. I was in the master editing suite, looking at the old 1980s monitors, when one of them, a small, black and white field monitor, suddenly flickered to life. It was showing a live image, but the feed was not from the internal station cameras. It was a shot of a man, sitting in the central anchor chair in the main studio. It was Walter, the anchor who had died on the air. He looked exactly as he must have in 1986, immaculately dressed, tie-clipped, hair slicked back. but his eyes were wide, staring in a fixed, silent terror. He was not moving, just sitting frozen in the set, a portrait of absolute, silent panic. I ran to the main studio. The room was dark, empty, and covered in a thick layer of dust. The anchor chair was vacant. I ran back to the monitor. Walter was still there. And as I watched, an expression of profound, silent agony began to wash over his face. He slowly, agonizingly, raised his hand and pointed a trembling finger at the camera. The terror was in the realization the camera was working. Walter was still in the studio, but in a different temporal and spiritual loop. The old equipment was pulling the scene from a moment of pure, sustained trauma. The entity had trapped the broadcast team in the final show, and the hardware was the prison. The next escalation was the most terrifying. The broadcast became interactive. I was in the control room when the ticking and the countdown stopped. It was replaced by a familiar sound. The low, desperate, frantic breathing of a man in extreme distress. Then, the monitor feed changed. The screen was filled with static, which quickly dissolved into a new image, a view of the main corridor of the station. The shot was shaky, clearly handheld, moving rapidly. It was a live feed from a ghost camera, running through the halls. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out of the control room. The feed was running down the main hallway, past the editing suites, toward the main power room. As I ran, I heard the sound of the ghost camera operator running with me. The sound was not in my ears. It was coming from the monitor speakers, a high-pitched, echoing footfall that perfectly synchronized with my own steps. The camera was not shooting an echo of the past. It was filming my own investigation. I ran to the power room, my heart hammering. I threw the door open, sweeping the light across the machinery. The room was empty. I looked at the monitor. The screen went black. A moment later, a single line of green text appeared on the screen, rendered in the classic 80s monitor font. "We're in the editing suite. You missed the cue." I ran back to the editing suite. The small black and white monitor was now displaying a terrifying, static close-up of my own reflection, my face pale, eyes wide with terror. The entity was now the director of the final broadcast, and I was the reluctant star. I spent the rest of the night in a state of absolute terror, huddled under the main console, listening to the silence. I quit the job the next morning, leaving all my tools and documents behind. I simply drove away, never looking back at the tower. I now work a public, outdoor job, surrounded by natural light and noise, avoiding all forms of electronic media. I don't own a television or a radio. But sometimes, when I'm using my phone, the screen will suddenly flash with a burst of static, and the sound will cut out. And for a brief, agonizing moment, I hear it, a faint, rhythmic ticking sound, and a breathy, male voice counting down. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. I know the final broadcast is still being edited. And I know that one day, when the countdown reaches 0, I'll be the one sitting in the anchor chair, staring silently into the camera. Story 19. I'm a novelist, and a cynical one at that. For 2 years, I'd been battling writer's block in my small, atmospheric apartment in Savannah, Georgia, staring at the humid, vine-covered brick of the buildings across the street. The muse was dead, and my life was as predictable as the tide. My name is Julian Cray. The story began with a random, insignificant purchase, a yellowed, brittle 1965 edition of the Savannah Morning News from an antique shop. I bought it for the cover art, but what caught my eye was a small, 2-column piece on the back page under the local crime blotter. The headline was stark. "Eerie coincidence claims local man." The article detailed the bizarre, improbable death of a man named Silas C. Wells. He was killed by a perfect, sequential chain of improbable accidents. He was late for a bus because his watch stopped, unforeseen mechanical failure, which caused him to take a taxi, an action he never took, which was hit by a truck carrying a shipment of pianos, a delivery scheduled for the next day, and he was crushed by a massive, falling piano. A perfect, tragic, highly orchestrated death, driven by a chain of seemingly random, awful luck. I was fascinated. This wasn't bad luck, it was a script. His life was consumed by a narrative he couldn't control. I started researching Silas Wells, finding his obituary and the location of his old house. My writer's block vanished. I began writing a novel about a man whose life was dictated by a malevolent, cosmic coincidence, a man written to death. But as I wrote, the coincidences started to happen in my own life. It began small, with the disruption of my routine. I am meticulous about my morning coffee. One morning, the coffee maker simply refused to work. I checked the wiring, the breaker, everything was fine. I drove to the nearest coffee shop, a small, independent place I never visited. As I walked out, a large, heavy tree branch snapped from a century-old oak tree directly above the spot where my car would have been parked at my home. A coincidence. Had my coffee maker not failed, the branch would have totaled my car. I was saved by the disruption of my routine. I felt a cold knot of dread. Silas Wells had started his fatal script with a faulty watch. The coincidences accelerated, each one a mirror of Silas's written death. I received a highly unusual, handwritten letter in my mailbox. It was from a distant relative I'd never met, containing a beautifully crafted vintage pocket watch, a family heirloom. I put it on my desk. The next morning, the watch was gone. I searched everywhere. The loss felt like a physical violation. Later that day, I was late for an appointment, and my phone, which I had just charged, died unexpectedly. I was forced to take a taxi, an action I never take. The taxi driver was chatty, telling me about his massive, overdue debt, and his desperation to make one more payment. He was, to my horror, driving a specific, unlit street that led to the city docks, a route I had never seen before. Then, the final, chilling link appeared. As the taxi turned onto the dock street, I saw it, a massive shipping container sitting sideways across the road, having clearly just fallen off a flatbed truck. The container was ripped open on one side, and visible in the wreckage was a pile of massive, black, glossy objects. Pianos. A shipping container full of pianos. I screamed at the driver to stop. He slammed the brakes, screeching to a halt inches from the wreckage. I sat there, shaking, staring at the scene, the exact, terrifying coincidence that had killed Silas Wells in 1965. I had entered the script. The cosmic hand that had written his life to an improbable end was now turning the pages of my own. I knew the entity wasn't a ghost. It was a malevolent, literary force, a force of pure narrative structure that demanded a tragic, perfectly coincidental ending. I went home, locked the door, and looked at my manuscript. The protagonist of my novel was a man who, like Silas, was being driven to an improbable death. I saw the truth. The story was not fiction. I was not writing a novel. I was documenting my own fate. The coincidence was an editor demanding a rewrite. And I was the next victim. I opened the manuscript, finding the last chapter, the chapter where my character dies in a massive, improbable accident. I looked at the words, the precise, chilling details of the final coincidence. I stood up, walked to my bookshelf, and grabbed a copy of an old, obscure work of philosophical literature, The Logic of Chaos. I found a random passage, a section on nonlinear narrative and the rejection of fate. I began to rewrite the final chapter of my novel, not with the tragic ending, but with the philosophical text. I deleted the details of the accident, the falling pianos, the faulty watches. I replaced the tragic ending with 5 pages of dense, esoteric philosophy, a complete, defiant rejection of the narrative structure. I finished the chapter, printed the new pages, and sat back, exhausted. The air in the room was electric, filled with a sound like tearing silk, the sound of the narrative thread being violently ripped apart. The moment the printer stopped, I heard a massive, reverberating thud from the street below. I rushed to the window. A large, 3-story section of the vine-covered brick wall across the street had collapsed. It lay in a smoking heap of rubble on the ground, having fallen outward, not inward. It was a massive, improbable accident. But it was only the wall. My apartment, my block, my life, it was untouched. The force of the coincidence had been violently redirected, the tragic energy diverted into the anonymous structure across the street. I had fought the narrative with anti-narrative, the only thing that could challenge the literary will of the entity. I quit writing entirely. I sold my apartment and moved to a small town in Oregon, where the news is boring and the weather is predictable. I work as a librarian, surrounded by books I have no control over. But sometimes, when I'm walking through the stacks, I look at the shelves and notice a small, familiar disruption. 2 books, placed side by side, entirely out of order. One is a historical analysis of the Savannah Fire Department. The other is a repair manual for a 1965 model of a taxicab. A small, chilling coincidence in the quiet chaos of the library. I quickly move the books, breaking the narrative link. I know the force is still out there, the cosmic editor, patiently searching for the proper plot points to return my life to the tragic path. I have to remain unpredictable, a living contradiction, to escape the final, written fate. Story 20. My name is Father Thomas Callahan. I'm not a conventional priest. I'm an exorcist and a field investigator for the church, a man who deals exclusively in the brutal, physical reality of the demonic. When I received the call from the Lakota Reservation in the Badlands of South Dakota, the details were chillingly familiar. A young man, Isaac, manifesting classic signs of high-level possession, glossolalia, extreme violence, and an unnerving, comprehensive knowledge of my own deepest sins. But the location, the sacred, desolate, windswept earth of the Badlands, signified that this was not merely a demon, it was a territorial, indigenous evil. I drove for 2 days into the desolate heart of the reservation, a landscape of raw, eroded earth and oppressive, skeletal silence. The air was cold, dry, and seemed to suck the moisture and sound out of everything. The house was a small, isolated wooden structure, miles from any paved road, perched precariously on a ridge overlooking the endless, barren, broken land. I met the family, aunts, uncles, a mother consumed by a terror that was part fear, part cultural shame. I was immediately given the rules: no electronics, no outside help, and the entire ceremony must be completed before the third sunrise. The isolation was absolute. My preparation was methodical: holy water, oils, the full, prescribed liturgy. The boy Isaac was kept secured in the single, small bedroom, tied to the heavy, iron frame of the bed. The sound emanating from the room was not human, a low, rhythmic, guttural chuffing sound, like a massive animal resting. I entered the room alone. The air was immediately thick and heavy, smelling of sulfur, burnt flesh, and the dusty, primordial scent of the earth. Isaac's eyes, when he looked at me, were completely, terrifyingly black, the whites consumed by an inky void. But it wasn't the eyes that terrified me. It was the smile, a wide, unnaturally stretched expression of pure, mocking malice that had nothing to do with the boy's face. I began the rite of exorcism, my voice steady, my Latin precise and loud, battling the pervasive fear. The demon, which immediately identified itself as a plural, ancient entity that called itself the Dust Eater, began its counterattack. It didn't use fire or levitation, it used psychological warfare aimed at my specific vulnerabilities. As I read the scripture, the demon, speaking through Isaac's small, strained voice, began to recite my own, private, decade-old confessional from memory, detailing the time I broke my vows, the doubts that haunted my faith, and the recurring nightmare of my sister's death. "You carry the guilt, Thomas!" the voice roared, a high-pitched, mocking parody of my own voice. "You are the architect of your own damnation. Do you truly believe your God would send a coward to fight a god of the earth?" The onslaught was overwhelming, designed to sever my link to my faith, the core of my power. I gripped the crucifix, forcing myself to continue, the holy words my only weapon. The Dust Eater then escalated to physical manifestation. As I neared the most powerful section of the rite, the command for the demon to declare its identity, the room began to shake. Not the frantic, dramatic shaking of a ghost, but a deep, rhythmic tremor, a heavy vibration that came from deep within the earth beneath the house. The demon laughed, a dry, rattling, bone-deep sound. "We are the earth, priest. We are the emptiness you stand on." Then, the wooden plank floor directly beneath my feet began to flex and creak inward, splintering loudly. A fine, black, greasy dust began to pour through the cracks, billowing upward into the room, smelling of sulfur and cold decay. As the dust filled the air, the physical violence began. The heavy iron bed frame holding Isaac began to vibrate violently, the metal rails blurring, the chains holding the boy snapping one by one with sharp, percussive cracks. Isaac was released. He did not get up. He simply levitated slowly, vertically, until he was hanging suspended a foot above the bed, his body perfectly still, the black eyes fixed on me. I threw the holy water at the floating figure. It did not sizzle. It simply hit the boy's body and immediately turned black, coagulating into dark, oily spots that smeared his clothes. I was out of protocol. The ancient, earthbound entity was immune to standard ritual. I was fighting a physical god in its temple. I dropped the book, abandoning the formal rite. I reverted to primal, confrontational faith. I looked at the demon, my voice raw and broken, shouting my own, personal challenge. "I am not worthy. I am a sinner. But the power is not mine, it is his. You have no dominion here." I raised the crucifix high. In a desperate, physical act of defiance, I charged the levitating figure, using the heavy, metal crucifix as a ram. I slammed the base of the crucifix directly into the center of the boy's chest. The result was an immediate, violent explosion of force. A massive, invisible blow struck me, throwing me backward across the small room, my head slamming against the far wall. The air was filled with a high-pitched, electrical shriek, a sound of pure, concentrated agony. I lay there stunned, watching through blurred vision. The floating figure of Isaac dropped back onto the bed with a heavy thud. The demonic blackness vanished from his eyes. His body began to convulse violently, a terrifying, internal struggle. And then, the sound I had been waiting for, the sound of the demon being ripped from the host. A final, dry, guttural cough of pure resentment, a sound of heavy, displaced mass moving through the air. The room fell silent. The dust settled. The smell of sulfur vanished. Isaac lay still on the bed, exhausted, but alive. I spent the next 3 days recovering and ensuring the boy's spiritual recovery. I never told the family the extent of the battle. I left the Badlands as soon as I could, the image of the black eyes and the smell of sulfur forever imprinted on my memory. I still perform exorcisms, but I've never faced an entity so deeply rooted in the physical world. The Dust Eater gave me a final parting gift. My lungs, fully exposed to the sulfurous dust, never fully recovered. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm praying, I feel a strange, familiar pressure, a cold, geological weight on my chest. And when I cough, the sound is not a simple clearing of the throat. It is a dry, rattling, heavy chuffing sound, just like the sound of a massive, ancient animal resting. The Dust Eater is gone, but I know a piece of the black, sulfurous earth is now permanently lodged in my lungs, a terrifying, physical souvenir of the day I fought a god of the desolate Badlands.